At precisely 2 a.m. on August 2, 1990, the rumble of 3 Iraqi tank divisions crossing the Kuwaiti border shattered the summer night. Within 12 hours, Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard had swallowed an entire nation, a brazen act of conquest unseen since Hitler's Blitzkrieg. The world's fourth-largest army, battle-hardened from 8 years of mechanized slaughter against Iran, had executed the kind of lightning war that military planners dream about and diplomats dread. Kuwait's emir fled in his Mercedes limousine just minutes ahead of Iraqi commandos storming his palace, while his tiny military, caught sleeping, literally, managed only scattered, futile resistance before being crushed under the treads of T-72 tanks. Saddam proclaimed his 19th province, miscalculating that the world would simply accept this fait accompli the way it had quietly tolerated his gassing of the Kurds, his war of attrition against Iran, and his systematic torture of dissidents. He was catastrophically wrong. 6 months later, the largest military coalition since World War II assembled through diplomatic wizardry that put Syrians and Saudis, Frenchmen and Egyptians, British commandos, and Kuwaiti resistance fighters under American command would unleash a storm of technology and firepower that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. What Saddam promised would be the mother of all battles, an apocalyptic quagmire that would break America's will and unite the Arab world behind him, became instead the fastest, most lopsided military victory in modern history. 100 hours of mechanized fury that ejected his vaunted army from Kuwait and shattered the myth of Iraqi military prowess so completely that Iraqi soldiers surrendered to journalists, to drones, and in one memorable incident, to an Italian film crew. This is the story of how a dictator's gamble on American weakness became a masterclass in how to win a war, and how the decision to stop after 100 hours would haunt 2 presidents and lead inexorably to another war 12 years later. Saddam Hussein learned violence early in the dust-choked alleyways of Tikrit, where blood feuds were settled with knives and survival meant striking first. Born in 1937 to a family so poor his mother tried to abort him, the boy who would terrorize a nation grew up sleeping with an iron bar under his pillow, beating street dogs for sport and idolizing his uncle, a convicted murderer and fervent Nazi sympathizer who filled the young Saddam's head with visions of Arab greatness and hatred of foreign powers. By age 20, he joined the Ba'ath Party and participated in a botched assassination attempt on Iraq's leader, taking a bullet in the leg and reportedly digging it out himself with a razor blade as he fled across the desert to Syria. The story was likely embellished, but Saddam understood early what his biographers would later document. In Iraqi politics, the most important currency wasn't truth, but the mythology of strength. He clawed his way to absolute power by 1979 through a combination of cunning brutality and Stalin-style purges, videotaping his first cabinet meeting as president while personally naming traitors, who were then dragged out and executed by their own colleagues, forcing everyone to become complicit in the bloodbath. Within months, he'd consolidated control through a network of secret police, informants in every neighborhood, and public executions broadcast on state television. But Saddam's Iraq, swimming in oil wealth and bristling with Soviet weapons, faced the same problem that had plagued ambitious dictators throughout history: ambition without patience. When Iran's Islamic Revolution exploded in 1979, toppling the Shah and bringing Ayatollah Khomeini's anti-Ba'athist zealots to power, Saddam saw both a threat and an opportunity. The new Iranian regime was chaotic, militarily weak, its officer corps gutted by revolutionary purges. Iraq could strike now, seize the oil-rich Khuzestan province, and establish Saddam as the unquestioned strongman of the Middle East. It would be, his generals assured him, a war of weeks, maybe months at most. 8 years later, The Iran-Iraq War finally sputtered to an exhausted stalemate in 1988, leaving behind 1 million dead, cities reduced to rubble, and Iraq drowning in $80 billion of debt, mostly owed to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had bankrolled Saddam's war against their mutual Persian enemy. But instead of gratitude, Saddam seethed with resentment. He'd fought Iran to protect the entire Arab world, he insisted, spilling Iraqi blood while the soft Gulf sheikhs counted their money from air-conditioned palaces. Now they had the audacity to demand repayment? Iraq's economy was shattered, inflation rampant, and reconstruction costs astronomical. Worse still, Kuwait was flooding the oil market, driving down prices and costing Iraq an estimated $14 billion annually in lost revenue. Saddam became convinced, or perhaps convinced himself, the line between delusion and calculation blurring, that Kuwait was waging economic warfare against Iraq, deliberately impoverishing his nation while simultaneously stealing Iraqi oil through slant drilling across the border. The technical evidence for the latter claim was dubious at best, but Saddam had never let inconvenient facts interfere with useful narratives. By July 1990, Saddam's public rhetoric had turned menacing. He accused Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates of stabbing Iraq with a poisoned dagger, comparing their oil overproduction to military aggression. Kuwait's crime, in Saddam's telling, wasn't just economic. It was historical. The British had artificially carved Kuwait from Iraq's natural territory in 1922, he argued, creating a fake nation to serve imperial interests. Iraq was simply reclaiming what had always been its 19th province. When Arab League mediators arranged a meeting in Jeddah at the end of July, Kuwait's representatives offered a paltry $9 billion in financial assistance, less than a tenth of Iraq's debt to them. Saddam's emissaries walked out. The diplomatic window had slammed shut, though almost no one realized it yet. What happened next remains one of the most analyzed and controversial diplomatic encounters in modern history. On July 25, 1990, just 8 days before the invasion, Saddam summoned U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie to his presidential palace. In a meeting that would be endlessly dissected and disputed, Saddam laid out his grievances against Kuwait, while Glaspie, following State Department guidance, emphasized America's desire for peaceful resolution, but notably avoided drawing any red lines. "We have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait," she told him, a statement that would later be parsed by historians as either diplomatic nuance or catastrophic ambiguity. Saddam heard what he wanted to hear. America wouldn't interfere. After all, the US had tilted toward Iraq during the Iran War, providing intelligence and looking the other way when Saddam gassed Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians. Washington valued stability and oil flow. Surely they'd accept another fait accompli in a region built on them. But Saddam had fundamentally misread the geopolitical chessboard. The Cold War was ending, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and President George H.W. Bush, a former CIA director and foreign policy veteran, was crafting a new world order where naked aggression couldn't be tolerated. More critically, Saddam had miscalculated the raw economics. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia together controlled nearly half the world's proven oil reserves. If Iraq absorbed Kuwait and menaced Saudi Arabia, Saddam would control the spigot of the global economy. That wasn't a border dispute between Arab neighbors. That was a gun pointed at the head of Western civilization. On August 2, 1990, at 2:00 a.m. local time, 100,000 Iraqi troops and 700 tanks crossed the border. Kuwait's 16,000-man military, caught in a peacetime posture with most officers at a wedding party, collapsed within hours. The emir's half-brother died defending Dasman Palace, buying just enough time for the royal family to escape. By dawn, Iraqi tanks were rolling down Arabian Gulf Street in Kuwait City. By afternoon, Saddam was on television proclaiming liberation of Iraq's 19th province from the traitorous al-Sabah family. The conquest had been textbook perfect, swift, overwhelming, and apparently unstoppable. Iraq now possessed 20% of the world's oil reserves and sat poised on Saudi Arabia's border with an army that had just demonstrated it could mobilize and strike with devastating speed. Saddam expected stern UN resolutions, angry editorials, perhaps some economic sanctions that his Soviet friends would help him weather. What he got instead was a phone call that would seal his fate. On August 8th, less than a week after the invasion, George Bush addressed the American people from the Oval Office with a declaration that would commit the United States to its largest military deployment since Vietnam. A line has been drawn in the sand. The president, who had promised a kinder, gentler America, was about to unleash the most devastating display of military power the world had seen in a generation. Saddam Hussein, who had spent his life mastering the brutal arithmetic of Middle Eastern power politics, had just made a calculation error that would cost him his army, his legacy, and ultimately his life. George Herbert Walker Bush received the news of Iraq's invasion while vacationing at his beloved compound in Kennebunkport, Maine. But it was during an Aspen conference in Colorado on August 2nd that the full weight of the crisis crystallized. Standing beside British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who would famously warn him days later, "Don't go wobbly on me, George," Bush made a visceral, almost instant decision that would define his presidency. This wasn't simply about Kuwait, a nation most Americans couldn't locate on a map. This was about preventing a brutal dictator from controlling the lifeblood of the global economy and establishing the principle that the post-Cold War world wouldn't tolerate naked conquest. Bush, the pragmatic diplomat who had navigated the peaceful end of the Cold War, now faced his first major military crisis. His response was unequivocal. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. But righteous determination couldn't change the terrifying reality confronting US Central Command. America had virtually nothing in the region to stop Saddam if he decided to keep rolling south. The nightmare scenario haunted every wargame session. Iraqi armored columns, flush with victory and momentum, plunging across Saudi Arabia's undefended northern border toward the oil fields of Dhahran and the port facilities at Ras Tanura. Intelligence analysts gave Iraq's battle-hardened Republican Guard units the capability to reach the Saudi oil infrastructure within days, maybe a week at most. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the bear-like commander of CENTCOM who'd spent years planning for Soviet aggression in Europe, not Arab invasions and deserts, candidly admitted to Pentagon officials, "We have nothing there to stop them." The 82nd Airborne could deploy light infantry within days. Speed bumps, some grimly called them, who die bravely while buying time for heavier forces. But real combat power, armor, artillery, air wings would take weeks to arrive. If Saddam wanted Saudi Arabia, the window was wide open. The key to everything was Saudi Arabia's King Fahd, and he was terrified, not just of Iraqi tanks, but of the domestic apocalypse that would follow his next decision. Inviting American troops, including women soldiers, onto Saudi soil, home to Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, would enrage religious conservatives and provide ammunition to extremists like a young Saudi firebrand named Osama bin Laden, who was already advocating that the kingdom should rely on mujahideen fighters, not Western infidels, for defense. The humiliation of needing American protection would undermine the House of Saud's carefully cultivated image as guardian of Islamic holy places. Fahd stalled, consulted, prayed. Meanwhile, satellite imagery showed Iraqi forces digging into defensive positions in Kuwait, but maintaining offensive capabilities pointed south. The intelligence was maddeningly ambiguous. Were they consolidating their gains or preparing for Phase 2? Dick Cheney, Bush's Secretary of Defense, and a man whose quiet intensity masked ruthless decisiveness, flew to Jeddah on August 6th with Schwarzkopf and a briefcase full of satellite imagery. In the royal palace, with its ornate carpets and careful protocol, Cheney laid out the evidence with stark clarity. Iraqi forces possessed the capability to strike the Saudi oil fields, and American intelligence couldn't guarantee they wouldn't. Then came the promise. The United States would deploy overwhelming military power to defend the kingdom, but this would require an unprecedented American presence on Saudi soil. Fahd, a cautious man thrust into an impossible choice, listened to his military advisors catalogue Saudi Arabia's inability to stop Iraq alone. After hours of consultation that stretched American nerves to breaking, the king gave his consent. The decision would alter the Middle East forever, creating the grievances that would eventually fuel al-Qaeda's campaign of terror. But in that moment, it prevented what might have been an even greater catastrophe. Operation Desert Shield began within hours of Fahd's agreement, launching the largest American military deployment since Vietnam. The 82nd Airborne's Ready Brigade began boarding transport aircraft on August 7th, jumping into a country they'd never seen to face an enemy they'd only studied in briefing books. F-15 Eagles from Langley. Air Force Base touched down at Saudi bases, pilots exhausted from the longest fighter deployment ever attempted. The logistical challenges were staggering, moving hundreds of thousands of troops, millions of tons of equipment, and entire support infrastructures across 7,000 miles of ocean into a desert kingdom whose ports and airfields had never handled such volume. Lieutenant General William Gus Pagonis, the logistical wizard tasked with the impossible, looked at the requirements and nearly laughed at the absurdity. The U.S. military would need to construct cities in the sand, complete with hospitals, dining facilities, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, vehicle repair centers, and enough spare parts to maintain the most technologically complex military machine in history, all while temperatures routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But Schwarzkopf's immediate nightmare wasn't logistics. It was the horrifying vulnerability of those first weeks. If Iraqi forces had attacked in early August, the American presence would have been annihilated, creating a political catastrophe that would make the fall of Saigon look like a minor setback. The 82nd Airborne Troopers dug defensive positions in the sand with the grim knowledge that they were essentially a tripwire force. Their job was to die slowly enough to justify massive American retaliation. One officer darkly joked that their motto should be speed bumps with airborne wings. The psychological burden was immense. Soldiers watched CNN in their tents, seeing talking head experts debate whether Saddam would invade Saudi Arabia while they sat in that exact invasion route with light weapons and prayers. Schwarzkopf himself was a volcano of anxiety wrapped in 3-star bluster. A Vietnam veteran who'd earned 3 silver stars and bore the psychic scars of that quagmire, he'd grown into a commander of Patton-esque bombast and surprising emotional depth. A man who could reduce subordinates to tears with his legendary temper, then weep openly at memorial services. He understood the terrible arithmetic. Desert Shield was either a massive bluff that would deter Saddam, or the preliminary deployment for a war that would dwarf anything America had fought in a generation. Either way, those first weeks represented the most vulnerable moment in modern American military history. If Iraqi tanks came south, young Americans would die buying time with their blood, and the responsibility would be his. As August dragged into September, the buildup gained momentum. The 24th Infantry Division's M181 Abrams tanks began rolling off transport ships at Ad Dammam Port. The 101st Airborne Division's helicopter fleet arrived, creating instant airmobile capability. Marine Corps units dug into defensive positions along the coast, prepared to meet Iraqi amphibious assaults that intelligence suggested might be coming. The US Air Force was establishing air superiority over the Saudi skies, with AWACS radar planes circling constantly and fighter jets on 5-minute alert. The vulnerability window was closing, but it wasn't shut yet, not by a long shot. What Bush and his advisors realized, however, was that defense alone wouldn't solve the crisis. Saddam showed no intention of withdrawing from Kuwait. He was annexing it, renaming Kuwait City Kadima, and systematically looting everything of value: museum artifacts, hospital equipment, luxury cars, even traffic lights, shipping them back to Baghdad like a medieval conqueror, claiming spoils. Kuwaiti resistors who fought back were tortured and executed. Women were raped by occupying forces. The stories filtering out through refugees painted a picture of systematic brutality designed to erase Kuwaiti identity and replace it with Iraqi control. Simply defending Saudi Arabia would abandon Kuwait to permanent subjugation and signal to dictators worldwide that conquest paid dividends as long as you stopped before threatening American interests directly. Bush faced an uncomfortable truth. Desert Shield would have to become Desert Storm. Deterrence was evolving into preparation for the largest American offensive operation since World War II. The question was no longer whether American forces would fight, but when, how, and with whom. Building the military muscle to eject Iraq from Kuwait would take months, but building the political coalition to make that ejection legitimate in the eyes of the world, that would require diplomatic virtuosity of the highest order. And it would require convincing the American people that Kuwait, a tiny autocratic monarchy that most couldn't find on a map last month, was worth American blood. As summer turned to fall in 1990, two parallel buildups were racing forward: military forces flowing into Saudi Arabia and diplomatic architecture being constructed in capitals worldwide. Schwarzkopf was building an army. Secretary of State James Baker was building a coalition, and Saddam Hussein, watching from Baghdad, was building the fortifications he believed would turn Kuwait into America's graveyard, confident that the soft Americans, still traumatized by Vietnam, would never have the stomach for the casualties required to dig his army out of its desert fortress. He was about to discover that while America had learned lessons from Vietnam, they weren't the ones he expected. James Baker, the Sr. III, the silver-haired Texan who served as Bush's Secretary of State, embarked on what would become the most intensive diplomatic marathon since the formation of NATO. His mission bordered on the impossible: construct a military coalition that would include ancient enemies, bridge unbridgeable religious divides, and somehow get Arab nations to fight alongside Israel's primary ally against a fellow Arab state, all while keeping the Soviet Union from vetoing everything at the UN Security Council. Baker's weapon wasn't military might, but something equally potent: his Rolodex. A lifetime of relationship building, poker game diplomacy, and carefully cultivated friendships was about to be stress-tested on a global stage. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Syria's Hafez al-Assad, the brutal dictator who'd bombed American Marines in Beirut, harbored terrorists, and represented everything Washington supposedly opposed. Assad was no friend of America, but he was an even greater enemy of Saddam Hussein. The two Ba'athist rivals had feuded for decades, and Assad saw an opportunity to curry Western favor while weakening his Iraqi nemesis. When Baker arrived in Damascus in September, Assad shocked the diplomatic world by committing Syrian troops to the coalition. The precedent was stunning. A regime on the State Department's terrorism list would fight under American operational command. Critics howled about moral compromise, but Baker understood the mathematics of coalition warfare. You didn't get to choose your allies based on their human rights records when you needed regional legitimacy for evicting an Arab leader from Arab territory. Egypt's participation was equally crucial and nearly as improbable. President Hosni Mubarak had personally mediated between Iraq and Kuwait just days before the invasion, and Saddam had looked him in the eye and promised no military action. The betrayal infuriated Mubarak, who viewed it as a personal humiliation and a violation of Arab brotherhood. But committing Egyptian forces to fight Iraq required navigating Egypt's own complex domestic politics. The Arab street was skeptical of American intentions, and Islamic fundamentalists were already painting the deployment as Egyptian soldiers serving as mercenaries for oil-rich monarchies. Mubarak's decision to send the Egyptian 3rd Mechanized Division wasn't just military calculation. It was a high-stakes gamble that Arab nationalism could be redirected against Iraqi aggression rather than American intervention. The symbolism was powerful. Egypt, the most populous Arab nation and traditional leader of the Arab world, was declaring that Saddam's conquest wouldn't stand. The Saudis, having invited the Americans in, now faced the delicate task of bankrolling the coalition while maintaining that this was an Arab-led defensive operation, not an American imperial venture. Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the kingdom's ambassador to Washington and a man who'd cultivated relationships with everyone from Ronald Reagan to CIA case officers, became the financial architect of the war effort. The Saudis would pay billions upon billions for American deployment costs, but the money would flow through carefully constructed channels that maintained the fiction of Saudi sovereignty. Kuwait's government in exile, living in luxury hotels in Taif, would contribute billions more. The Gulf states lined up with their checkbooks open. Baker understood that coalition warfare in the modern age wasn't just about troops. It was about who paid the bills. Getting others to fund American military power while maintaining American operational control was diplomatic jiu-jitsu of the highest order. The trickiest negotiation, however, involved the Soviet Union, Iraq's longtime patron and arms supplier. Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to hold together a disintegrating empire while navigating the end of the Cold War. And the last thing he needed was a confrontation with the United States over Iraq. But Soviet hardliners still viewed Iraq as a client state worth protecting, and the USSR had billions in outstanding Iraqi debt for weapons systems and military training. Baker flew to Moscow with a proposition that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Let's work together to isolate Saddam through the UN Security Council, and in return, the Soviets could maintain diplomatic cover while the Americans did the heavy lifting. Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, a pragmatist who understood that the old Cold War rules no longer applied, saw the wisdom in not defending the indefensible. When the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678 on November 29th, authorizing all necessary means to eject Iraq from Kuwait if they didn't withdraw by January 15, 1991, the Soviet Union didn't veto. It was a watershed moment. The two superpowers that had nearly destroyed the world over Cuba in 1962 were now coordinating against a regional aggressor. Britain's Margaret Thatcher needed no convincing. Her commitment was instant, total, and accompanied by her famous steel-spined rhetoric. "Don't go wobbly on me, George," she'd told Bush, though by autumn she'd been replaced by John Major, who maintained Britain's commitment with slightly less dramatic flair. The British would send 53,000 troops, including the famous Desert Rats, the 7th Armoured Brigade that had fought Rommel in North Africa. France, ever protective of its independent foreign policy, initially hesitated before committing 18,000 troops, including the storied Foreign Legion. President François Mitterrand insisted on maintaining French operational independence, creating coordination headaches for Schwarzkopf, but providing crucial European legitimacy for the operation. The smaller contributions carried outsized symbolic weight. Canada sent CF-18 fighters and naval vessels. Italy contributed Tornado strike aircraft. The Netherlands deployed Patriot missile batteries. Even nations without significant military capabilities found ways to participate: Japan and Germany. constitutionally restricted from combat deployments, wrote massive checks instead. Baker kept a running tally like a campaign fundraiser. 28 nations committed to the coalition, with contributions ranging from combat brigades to medical units to financial support. It was the most diverse military coalition since World War II, and it existed for one purpose: demonstrating that this wasn't America acting unilaterally, but the international community enforcing international law. But the coalition's breadth created its own problems. Arab members insisted that Israel stay out of the conflict entirely, fearing that Israeli involvement would fracture Arab participation and transform the crisis into the familiar Israel versus Arabs dynamic that Saddam desperately wanted. This created a perverse strategic situation. If Iraq attacked Israel, as intelligence suggested Saddam might do with Scud missiles, Israel would have to absorb the punishment without retaliating, violating every instinct of Israeli defense doctrine. Getting the Israelis to agree to sit on their hands while their cities were bombed required promises of American protection, deployment of Patriot missile batteries to Israel, and quiet assurances that the US military would hunt down Iraqi Scud launchers with extreme prejudice. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir agreed, but the arrangement was fragile, depending on Saddam's attacks being limited enough that Israeli public opinion wouldn't demand retaliation. The coalition's political architecture was nearly as complex as its military organization. Arab forces would nominally operate under Arab command, but coordinate with American Central Command. French forces maintained their independent chain of command while integrating with overall coalition strategy. The Saudis needed to appear to be hosting the coalition, not serving under it, requiring elaborate protocols about which flags flew, where and who gave orders to whom. Schwarzkopf, navigating this diplomatic minefield while trying to plan actual military operations, sometimes exploded in frustration at the Byzantine arrangements. But the complexity served a purpose. It provided political cover for every participating nation to explain to their domestic audiences why they were fighting in a distant desert for reasons that weren't always obvious to publics skeptical of foreign entanglements. By January 1991, Baker had achieved the impossible: a genuine international coalition with UN authorization, Arab participation, European commitment, Soviet acquiescence, and Japanese-German financing. It was a diplomatic masterclass, the kind of alliance building that wouldn't be seen again. The coalition wasn't just militarily powerful, it was politically legitimate in a way that would prove impossible to replicate in future conflicts. Every member had different motives. Some were settling old scores with Saddam, some were protecting oil supplies, some were defending international law, some were buying American goodwill, and some were simply ensuring they had a seat at the table when the post-war order was determined. But they were all pointed in the same direction: getting Iraq out of Kuwait. As the January 15th UN deadline approached, one final question remained. Would Saddam blink? Did he understand that he faced not just American power, but the combined weight of the international community? Or had he convinced himself that this hodgepodge coalition would fracture under pressure, that Arab publics would rise up against their leaders, that America would lose its nerve? Baker's diplomatic triumph had created the coalition. Now it would be Schwarzkopf's job to prove whether it could actually fight together. The world's most elaborate diplomatic architecture was about to become the world's most elaborate military machine. And somewhere in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was fortifying Kuwait, confident that his impenetrable defenses would break this paper tiger alliance the moment American body bags started coming home. Norman Schwarzkopf had a recurring nightmare: young Americans drowning in desert sand, bogged down in trenches, their tanks burning while CNN broadcast the carnage into living rooms across America. Vietnam haunted him, not abstractly, but viscerally. He'd served 2 tours there, watched friends die in jungles, seen superior firepower mean nothing against determined enemies fighting on home terrain. Now he commanded the largest American deployment since that debacle, and every decision carried the weight of those ghosts. When Pentagon planners initially calculated that 200,000 troops would suffice to defend Saudi Arabia, Schwarzkopf looked at Iraqi force dispositions and nearly laughed at the absurdity. Defense was one thing. Ejecting a dug-in army from fortified positions was something else entirely. He told Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, exactly what he needed. Double it. Then double it again. If America was going to war, it would go with such overwhelming force that victory was mathematically inevitable. Powell, architect of the doctrine bearing his name, agreed completely. The result was a logistical miracle that dwarfed D-Day. Between August 1990 and February 1991, the United States military moved 500,000 troops, 117,000 vehicles, 2,000 tanks, 1,800 helicopters, 2,000 artillery pieces, 100 naval vessels, and 1,800 fixed-wing aircraft across 7,000 miles of ocean and air. Lieutenant General Gus Pagonis, the logistics commander whose unglamorous job was to make this mathematical impossibility work, faced challenges that would have broken lesser minds. Saudi Arabia had exactly 2 major ports, Ad-Dammam and Al-Jubail, and limited airfield capacity. Traffic jams of transport ships waited days for berths to offload tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter transport planes landed every 7 minutes at peak periods, disgorging troops and equipment in what became the largest airlift in history, surpassing even the Berlin airlift. The planes burned through tires so fast that the Air Force nearly ran out of replacements globally. Pagonis attacked the problem with industrial-age thinking applied to digital-age warfare. He established massive supply depots in the desert, instant cities of containerized supplies, fuel bladders holding millions of gallons, ammunition dumps stretching across square miles, vehicle parks that resembled car lots from hell. Everything needed to sustain a mechanized army in a barren wasteland had to be shipped in. Food, water, fuel, spare parts, toilet paper, medical supplies, letters from home. The Army's just-in-time supply system, designed for Cold War conflicts in Europe with established infrastructure, had to be completely reimagined for desert warfare where the nearest Home Depot was 7,000 miles away. Pagonis instituted a barcode tracking system, revolutionary for 1990 military logistics, allowing commanders to locate specific containers among hundreds of thousands. When a tank battalion needed transmission parts, the system could pinpoint which ship they were on, which container held them, and when they'd arrive. It was Amazon before Amazon existed, except the packages were 70-ton tanks. The human element was equally daunting. Thousands of American troops had never left their home states, and suddenly they were living in tents in 120-degree heat, eating MREs, meals ready to eat, which soldiers darkly joked were meals rejected by Ethiopians, and adjusting to a culture where alcohol was forbidden and women had to cover themselves off base. The Saudi government had reluctantly agreed to allow American women soldiers, a first for the kingdom, but the cultural collision created constant friction. Female soldiers drove trucks, operated communications equipment, and flew helicopters in a country where women couldn't drive cars. Islamic religious police initially tried to enforce Saudi customs on American servicewomen, creating diplomatic incidents that required careful navigation by officers who suddenly found themselves doing cultural mediation alongside military planning. The boredom was crushing. Soldiers dubbed their tent cities, Cement City and Log Base Echo, and other utilitarian names that captured the soul-numbing monotony of waiting in the desert. They filled endless hours watching bootleg videos, lifting improvised weights, writing letters home, and obsessing over mail call, the highlight of any day. Sports Illustrated swimsuit issues became cherished contraband, circulated until they fell apart. Some units organized elaborate practical jokes to break the tedium. Others created makeshift gyms, volleyball courts, and basketball hoops. Prayer services, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, provided solace and structure. The army prohibited alcohol and deference to Saudi law, creating a stone-sober force that channeled frustration into training, fitness, and increasingly dark humor about when or if they'd actually fight. Training filled some of the void, but created its own anxieties. Tank crews practiced desert navigation, discovering that the featureless terrain meant GPS and dead reckoning were essential. A wrong turn could leave a tank platoon hopelessly lost in a sea of sand. Infantry units rehearsed breaching operations against mock Iraqi trenches, practicing with mine-clearing line charges and engineer vehicles. Helicopter pilots flew low-level navigation missions, learning to cope with sandstorms that reduced visibility to zero, and heat thermals that made flying at midday feel like wrestling a mechanical bull. The 82nd Airborne conducted desert jump training, paratroopers discovering that landing in soft sand was preferable to European drop zones, but that the heat could dehydrate them before they even hit the ground. The chemical weapons threat haunted every training evolution. Iraqi forces had used chemical weapons extensively against Iran. Mustard gas, sarin nerve agent, tabun, and intelligence suggested large stockpiles remained available. Every soldier carried a gas mask and practiced donning it in under 9 seconds. They learned to inject themselves with atropine auto-injectors in case of nerve agent exposure. Chemical weapons drills became routine. The alarm sounds, you have seconds to mask up, then you continue your mission in a charcoal-lined EMOP suit, mission-oriented protective posture that felt like wearing a sauna in hell. Soldiers tried to imagine fighting in those suits, moving, shooting, driving tanks, flying helicopters, all while wondering if the next artillery shell contained something more deadly than high explosive. The psychological burden was immense. Many wrote last letters home, sealed them, and left instructions with chaplains about delivery conditions. Schwarzkopf prowled his headquarters, a nondescript building in Riyadh that became the nerve center for the coalition, alternating between volcanic rage and surprising tenderness. His staff learned to read the warning signs. When the bear started pacing and his voice dropped to a dangerous quiet, someone was about to get eviscerated. He demanded perfection, rewarded excellence, and had zero tolerance for bureaucratic excuse-making. But soldiers who met him in the field found a commander who genuinely cared about their welfare, who asked about their families, who understood that behind every unit designation was a collection of young Americans far from home. He visited troops relentlessly, shaking hands, posing for photos, listening to complaints about mail delivery or food quality, then returning to headquarters to tear into logistics officers about fixing those exact problems. The coalition's diversity created bizarre juxtapositions. American soldiers trained alongside Saudi National Guard units who'd never worked with Western forces. British troops integrated with American brigades, their different equipment and procedures requiring careful coordination. French forces maintained splendid isolation while technically coordinating operations. Syrian soldiers, the same army that had fought Israel in multiple wars, now prepared to fight under the same strategic umbrella as American forces that defended Israel. Egyptian tank crews operated Soviet-built T-62s that looked uncomfortably similar to Iraqi tanks, requiring elaborate identification protocols to prevent fratricide. The Kuwaiti resistance forces, eager for revenge, needed to be carefully managed to prevent them from conducting unauthorized raids that might trigger the war prematurely. By December, the force structure was taking shape. 7. Corps, the heavy armored fist that had defended West Germany's Fulda Gap against potential Soviet invasion, was being transferred wholesale to Saudi Arabia, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, the 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. These weren't light mobile forces. They were Cold War behemoths designed to slug it out with Soviet tank armies. Their M1A1 Abrams tanks, mounting 120-meter smoothbore guns and Chobham armor, were technological marvels that had never been tested in large-scale combat. The Bradley fighting vehicles, criticized in the press as overpriced death traps, would finally prove their worth or validate their critics. The helicopters, Apaches, Blackhawks, Chinooks, represented an entire dimension of warfare that had evolved since Vietnam. The Marines established positions along the coast, preparing for what many assumed would be an amphibious assault into Kuwait. They practiced beach landings, rehearsed breaching operations, and prepared for urban combat in Kuwait City. The 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles, transformed their helicopters into a mobile strike force capable of leapfrogging deep into Iraqi territory. The 82nd Airborne, having arrived first as the speed bump, now trained for different missions, possibly airborne assaults behind Iraqi lines, possibly rapid reaction forces to plug breaches in coalition lines. But as Christmas approached and the January 15th UN deadline loomed, the troops still didn't know if they'd actually fight. Maybe Saddam would withdraw at the last minute, making this entire deployment a massive bluff that worked. Maybe diplomacy would prevail. Maybe the Soviets would broker a face-saving compromise. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Warriors trained for war, but prayed for peace, even while preparing to unleash violence on an unprecedented scale. Chaplains were busy. So were psychiatrists. Letters home became more frequent, more intimate, more filled with unspoken fears. Schwarzkopf knew the deadline was arbitrary, a diplomatic fiction designed to give Saddam one last chance. But it also gave the coalition time to build the overwhelming force that made victory certain. By mid-January, the pieces would be in place: 700,000 coalition troops, the most advanced military technology ever assembled, air superiority so complete that Iraqi forces would be blind and helpless. The nightmare scenario of Vietnam, graduated escalation, limited objectives, political constraints on military action, had been replaced by its opposite: unlimited buildup, clear objectives, political support for decisive action. The Powell Doctrine in action. But first, one more element needed to fall into place. All the ground forces in the world meant nothing if the air campaign failed, and Schwarzkopf's secret weapon wasn't his tanks, or his Marines, or his helicopter gunships. It was the invisible technology that would strike first, strike hardest, and turn Iraq's vaunted air defenses into a trillion-dollar pile of smoking wreckage. The world was about to witness a new kind of warfare, one where stealth trumped strength and precision trumped numbers. The age of carpet bombing was ending. The age of surgical strikes was about to begin with a shock that would echo through military doctrine for decades. January 15th was coming, and with it, the decision that would determine whether this massive buildup became the greatest deterrent force in history, or the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. While coalition forces trained in the Saudi desert, Saddam Hussein was transforming Kuwait into what he believed would be America's graveyard. Iraqi combat engineers, many of them veterans of 8 years of trench warfare against Iran, had learned their terrible craft well. They constructed a defensive network that stretched along Kuwait's southern border with Saudi Arabia, a medieval nightmare reimagined with modern technology. The first obstacle was the sand berms. Massive earthen walls bulldozed to heights of 15 feet, steep enough to stop tanks dead in their tracks. Behind the berms came the trenches, not the simple fighting positions of World War I, but sophisticated networks with reinforced bunkers, overhead cover, and interlocking fields of fire. Iraqi troops could move through these trench systems unseen, repositioning to meet attacks from multiple directions. But the trenches were just the beginning. Iraqi engineers laid minefields with methodical precision, anti-tank mines that could blow the treads off an M1 Abrams, anti-personnel mines designed to maim rather than kill. Wounded soldiers require more resources than dead ones, a cold calculus of modern warfare. Intelligence estimates suggested over 1 million mines had been laid, though the actual number would never be known with certainty. Some fields were marked, most weren't. They stretched for miles in irregular patterns, specifically designed to channel attacking forces into kill zones where Iraqi artillery had already calculated firing solutions. Finding paths through these minefields under fire would require either suicidal bravery or technological solutions that didn't yet exist in doctrine manuals. The most diabolical innovation was the fire trenches, long ditches filled with crude oil that could be ignited to create walls of flame. Iraqi engineers had studied how fire could stop armor, creating an obstacle that couldn't be breached by tanks or Bradleys. The psychological impact was equally important. Soldiers charging through walls of fire while wearing chemical protection gear and breathing apparatus would be disoriented, terrified, and vulnerable. Saddam's engineers had test-fired some of these trenches, and the results were spectacular. Black smoke billowing thousands of feet into the air, heat intense enough to be felt hundreds of yards away, flames that would burn for hours. American commanders studying intelligence photos of these preparations felt their stomachs tighten. This wasn't going to be a cakewalk. Iraqi artillery was positioned in depth, with everything from elderly Soviet M30 howitzers to modern self-propelled guns. The guns were dug into revetments, earthen bunkers that protected them from air attack while allowing them to fire over the defenses. Forward observers had pre-sighted coordinates for every likely avenue of approach. When coalition forces attacked, they'd be walking into a steel rain of high explosive and, everyone feared, possibly chemical weapons. Iraqi forces had stockpiles of mustard gas, sarin, and tabun. Intelligence photos showed chemical storage facilities, decontamination trucks, and specialized artillery shells. The question wasn't whether Iraq had chemical weapons. They'd use them against Iran and their own Kurdish population, but whether Saddam would use them against coalition forces and risk the all-means-necessary retaliation that Bush had darkly hinted at, which everyone understood meant potential nuclear response. The Republican Guard held the strategic reserve positions, positioned north of Kuwait proper, where they could respond to breakthroughs, and, Saddam hoped, counterattack through any gaps in coalition lines. These weren't the conscript infantry cowering in southern trenches. These were Iraq's elite units, the Hammurabi Division, the Medina Division, the Tawakalna Division, equipped with T-72 tanks and veteran of years of combat against Iran. Iraqi propaganda portrayed them as invincible, the shield of the Arab nation. They'd certainly performed adequately against Iranian human wave attacks and disorganized militia forces. Whether they could stand against modern Western armor doctrine was about to be tested in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. Saddam's strategic calculation rested on a fundamental assumption about American psychology. Vietnam had broken America's will to accept casualties. He'd watched the US withdraw from Lebanon after a single truck bomb killed 241 Marines in 1983. He'd seen American forces pull out of Somalia after 18 casualties in 1993's Black Hawk Down incident, though this was still in the future. Saddam was extrapolating from past patterns. His theory was simple: inflict enough casualties early, create enough dramatic footage of burning American tanks and body bags, and American public opinion would force Bush to negotiate. The defenses in Kuwait were designed not necessarily to win the war, but to make winning too expensive for American political stomachs to handle. It was the same calculation that North Vietnam had made, and that strategy had worked. But Saddam had miscalculated in ways he couldn't understand. The all-volunteer force that Bush had deployed bore little resemblance to the drafted army that fought in Vietnam. These soldiers had chosen military service, trained relentlessly, and operated equipment that represented a generational leap in technology. More critically, Bush had structured the deployment deliberately to avoid Vietnam's mistakes: clear objectives, overwhelming force, coalition legitimacy, and crucially, the authorization to use that force without political micromanagement. There would be no graduated escalation, no restricted targeting lists approved by White House staffers, no fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. When the war started, it would be total, devastating, and designed to end quickly. The human shield strategy represented Saddam's most cynical calculation. In August and September, Iraqi forces had rounded up Western nationals, Americans, British, French, Germans, working in Kuwait and Iraq, transporting them to strategic sites as living shields against air attack. The footage of Saddam meeting with British hostages, patting a terrified young boy on the head while asking if he was getting his milk, played on television worldwide, generating revulsion rather than the sympathy Saddam apparently expected. Stuart Lockwood, that frightened 5-year-old boy, became an unwitting symbol of Saddam's brutality. The hostage strategy eventually collapsed under international pressure and the recognition that it was generating hostile propaganda rather than deterrence. By December, most hostages had been released, but the episode revealed Saddam's fundamental misreading of Western psychology. He thought displaying power over civilians would demonstrate strength, not realizing it merely hardened coalition resolve. Meanwhile, Iraqi forces were systematically brutalizing Kuwait itself. Kuwaiti resistance fighters who were caught faced torture in makeshift prisons. Iraqi soldiers looted systematically, everything from luxury cars to hospital incubators. Later reports of babies being thrown from incubators would be revealed as exaggerated propaganda, but the underlying pattern of looting was real. The Kuwaiti central bank was emptied of gold reserves. Museum artifacts were shipped to Baghdad. Even street signs and traffic lights were stolen and transported north. It was conquest in the medieval sense. Victors' spoils taken as tribute. Refugees streaming into Saudi Arabia brought stories of brutality that fueled coalition determination. The most haunting reports involved chemical weapons preparation. Intelligence photos showed Iraqi troops practicing in full chemical protection gear. Decontamination vehicles were positioned near artillery units. Chemical officers were identified in frontline positions. American troops training in Saudi Arabia knew these signs meant Iraq was preparing to use chemical weapons, not just threatening to use them. The anthrax attacks, sarin shells, mustard gas artillery rounds, all were thought to be in Iraqi arsenals. Every soldier carried an atropine injector and practiced the 9-second drill. Gas alarm sounds. Hold your breath. Don the mask. Clear the mask. Inject yourself if you're exposed. Continue mission. The calm, clinical language of training manuals couldn't disguise the terror inherent in those procedures. Iraqi forces in Kuwait numbered somewhere around 350,000 troops by January. Estimates varied wildly because Iraqi unit strength fluctuated as soldiers deserted or were rotated. These weren't all elite forces. Many were conscripts from Shiite southern Iraq or Kurdish regions, drafted into service for a cause they didn't necessarily support. Their morale was questionable, their supplies irregular, and their training focused on defensive positions rather than mobile warfare. But they were dug into positions that had been carefully prepared over months, and defensive warfare favors the defender, especially when that defender is willing to accept horrific casualties. Saddam's public statements grew increasingly apocalyptic as January 15th approached. He promised the mother of all battles, warned that coalition forces would swim in their own blood, and invoked Islamic holy war against infidel invaders. Iraqi television broadcast footage of troops training, artillery firing, and Saddam reviewing Republican Guard units. The propaganda was designed to show strength, but Western intelligence analysts noticed details that told different stories: soldiers who looked undernourished, equipment that appeared poorly maintained, defensive positions that showed fear rather than confidence. Iraq was preparing to be attacked, not to attack. For all the bluster about counteroffensives and victory, the defensive preparations revealed that Iraqi commanders expected to absorb an assault and try to make it too costly to continue. The psychological warfare cut both ways. Coalition aircraft began dropping leaflets over Iraqi positions, millions of them, fluttering down like snow, offering instructions on how to surrender, promising good treatment, showing maps of safe surrender routes. Some leaflets had Quranic verses about the futility of following unjust leaders. Others had crude but effective cartoons showing the overwhelming technological superiority coalition forces possessed. Iraqi officers tried to confiscate the leaflets and punish soldiers caught reading them. But the seed was planted. Surrender might be preferable to defending Saddam's conquest. As January 15th dawned and passed without Iraqi withdrawal, the world held its breath. Bush had promised to use all means necessary if Iraq didn't comply. The coalition had been built, the forces deployed, the ultimatums delivered. Saddam's fortress in Kuwait waited, bristling with mines and artillery and chemical weapons and 350,000 soldiers in trenches. The question now wasn't whether war would come. That decision had been made. The question was when the first blow would fall, and from where, and whether Saddam's medieval fortress could withstand the most advanced military technology ever assembled. In the desert camps, coalition soldiers made final preparations, cleaned weapons, wrote last letters, said prayers, and waited for orders that would send them into the fortress that Saddam promised would be America's graveyard. Somewhere in the darkness, invisible aircraft were already warming up their engines, preparing to deliver an opening strike so devastating that it would redefine warfare for a generation. The age of precision air power was about to dawn, and dawn was coming soon. At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, the sky over Baghdad erupted in a light show that resembled a violent thunderstorm mixed with 4th of July fireworks. Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners, alerted by air raid sirens, opened fire blindly into the darkness, their tracer rounds arcing upward in desperate patterns, while surface-to-air missiles streaked toward targets they couldn't see. CNN correspondent Bernard Shaw, broadcasting live from the Al Rashid Hotel, provided the world with real-time narration of warfare's new era. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're seeing bright flashes going off all over the sky. What Shaw couldn't see, what Iraqi air defense operators couldn't see, were the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters that had already penetrated Baghdad's defenses and were methodically destroying command bunkers, communication centers, and air defense headquarters with laser-guided precision. The air campaign's opening hours represented the culmination of decades of American investment in technology that seemed like science fiction. The F-117's angular black aircraft that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of mathematicians obsessed with radar deflection had taken off from bases in Saudi Arabia hours earlier. Their pilots flew in total radio silence, navigating by GPS and infrared sensors, carrying 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs toward targets they'd studied for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Getchell and his squadron mates hit the Iraqi Air Force headquarters at H-3 Air Base with such precision that adjacent buildings remained untouched. The building simply collapsed inward as if God had reached down and crushed it with an invisible fist. The bombs went through ventilation shafts and doorways, exploding inside to maximize destruction while minimizing collateral damage. This wasn't carpet bombing. This was surgical warfare. Simultaneously, AH-64 Apache helicopters were conducting one of the most audacious missions of the war, a raid that would later be known simply as Task Force Normandy. 9 Apaches from the 101st Airborne flew 50 feet above the desert in pitch darkness, navigating by terrain-following radar toward 2 early warning radar sites on Iraq's border with Saudi Arabia. These sites were the eyes of Iraq's air defense network. Take them out, and a corridor opened for the main air assault. At precisely 2:38 a.m., synchronized with the F-117 strikes on Baghdad, the Apaches unleashed Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire, obliterating both radar installations within minutes. Chief Warrant Officer Lou Hall, flying lead Apache, later described the scene through his thermal sights. "It looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to a television set. Everything just exploded and went dark. The corridor was open. The air armada poured through. The scale of the air assault defied comprehension. Over 700 coalition aircraft struck Iraq in the first 24 hours, F-15 Eagles establishing air superiority, F-16 Fighting Falcons hitting airfields and command centers, FA-18 Hornets striking Republican Guard positions, B-52 Stratofortresses carpet-bombing troop concentrations, A-10 Warthogs destroying tanks and artillery. Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles, robotic weapons that flew autonomous missions guided by terrain-matching computers, struck targets with eerie precision. One missile famously flew through the doorway of the Iraqi Air Force headquarters. Another made a right turn at an intersection in downtown Baghdad before hitting its target. Iraqis watching from rooftops could see these missiles flying at rooftop level, maneuvering around buildings, hunting their programmed targets like mechanical predators. Iraqi air defenses, which Western analysts had rated as the 6th largest in the world, proved spectacularly ineffective against stealth and precision. The integrated air defense system, radars, SAM sites, anti-aircraft artillery, all coordinated through Soviet-designed command centers, was designed to defend against mass bomber raids using World War II tactics. It had no answer for stealth aircraft that didn't appear on radar screens, cruise missiles too small and fast for visual tracking, and jamming so sophisticated that Iraqi radar operators saw nothing but electronic snow on their screens. The famous footage of tracers filling Baghdad's sky represented not effective defense, but desperate, blind firing. Anti-aircraft gunners shooting at sounds, at rumors, at ghosts. The initial assessment was that Iraq's air defense had been decapitated within hours, but that proved optimistic. Iraqi forces had learned from Israel's 1981 strike on the Osirak reactor and had built redundancy into everything. Mobile SAM launchers relocated constantly. Fiber optic communication cables couldn't be jammed. Backup command centers activated when primary sites were destroyed. The air campaign had inflicted devastating damage, but Iraqi air defenses remained dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Scott Spiker's FA-18, shot down on the first night, proved that Iraqi SAM operators were still lethal when they got lucky, or when pilots made mistakes. Spiker would be listed as KIA, the first American combat death of the war, though his fate would remain controversial for years. But the bigger surprise came from Iraq's Air Force. Intelligence had predicted they'd fight. 200-plus modern fighters, including French Mirages and Soviet MiG-29s, flown by pilots with combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War. Instead, Iraqi pilots displayed a bizarre passivity. Coalition fighters established combat air patrols over Iraq, daring Iraqi fighters to come up. Few did. When they did engage, the results were lopsided massacres. F-15 Eagles, equipped with beyond visual range missiles and AWACS guidance, shot down Iraqi fighters before Iraqi pilots even knew Americans were there. Captain Steve Tate scored one of the first air-to-air kills, destroying an Iraqi Mirage with an AIM-7 Sparrow missile from 25 miles away. The Iraqi pilot never saw what killed him. By late January, Iraqi pilots were making a decision that stunned coalition planners. They were fleeing to Iran. One by one, then in groups, Iraqi aircraft, including some of their most advanced fighters, flew east to their former enemy rather than face American air superiority. Eventually, over 120 Iraqi aircraft would seek refuge in Iran, a desperate gamble that Iran would return them after the war. Iran, remembering 8 years of Iraqi aggression, impounded every aircraft and never returned them. Saddam's air force, which was supposed to be a major threat, had simply given up. The skies belonged exclusively to the coalition. With air supremacy secured, the air campaign transitioned to systematic destruction of Iraq's military infrastructure. Targets were prosecuted with methodical precision: bridges across the Tigris and Euphrates to prevent reinforcement of Kuwait, command bunkers to disrupt coordination, telecommunications facilities to isolate Iraqi units, military production facilities to destroy war-making capacity, oil refineries to eliminate fuel supplies. Every target was analyzed for collateral damage potential. Lawyers reviewed targeting lists to ensure compliance with laws of war. The effort to wage precision warfare was genuine, if imperfect. But precision had its dark side, and on February 13th, it produced the war's most controversial incident. An F-117 dropped 2 laser-guided bombs on the Al-Firdos bunker in Baghdad, a facility that intelligence identified as a military command center. The bombs penetrated the hardened concrete and exploded inside, creating an inferno. What intelligence hadn't known, or had known and disregarded, was that Iraqi civilians had been sheltering in the bunker overnight. When Iraqi television cameras arrived at dawn, they filmed scenes of horror. Charred bodies being carried out, women wailing, children among the dead. The death toll was somewhere between 200 and 400 civilians. CNN broadcast the footage worldwide. The incident sparked furious debate. Was it a legitimate military target? Had Iraqi forces deliberately placed civilians there as propaganda fodder? Did American intelligence fail? The answers were murky, lost in the fog of war, but the images were stark. A reminder that even precision weapons created imprecise consequences when intelligence was wrong, or when enemies cynically mixed military and civilian infrastructure. The controversy forced a temporary pause in bombing Baghdad, but the broader air campaign continued unabated. F-15E Strike Eagles hunted Iraqi Scud missile launchers in the western desert, a mission that proved maddeningly difficult because the mobile launchers could set up, fire, and relocate in minutes. A-10 Warthogs, ugly, slow aircraft designed for one purpose: killing tanks, began systematic destruction of Iraqi armor in Kuwait. The A-10's 30-meter GAU-8 Avenger cannon, firing depleted uranium rounds, could punch through a tank's top armor like a can opener. Pilots described the carnage almost clinically: lock on to a T-72 with infrared sensors, fire a 2-second burst, watch the tank's ammunition cook off in spectacular secondary explosions. The Iraqi tankers never knew what hit them. Just death from above, invisible and unstoppable. The psychological impact on Iraqi troops in Kuwait was crushing. Coalition aircraft owned the sky 24 hours a day. Any movement during daylight brought instant air attack. Iraqi forces could only move at night, and even then, thermal imaging allowed coalition pilots to see heat signatures through darkness. Supply convoys were obliterated, command posts were destroyed, armored concentrations were pounded by B-52 strikes that turned square miles of desert into moonscapes. Iraqi troops huddled in bunkers, unable to sleep because the bombing never stopped, unable to move because movement meant death, unable to retreat because Saddam had placed security forces behind the lines to shoot deserters. The Scud attacks on Israel represented Iraq's only offensive success, and even that was tactical desperation, rather than strategic wisdom. Modified Soviet-era ballistic missiles, inaccurate, unreliable, but terrifying for populations who had no defense, rained down on Tel Aviv and Haifa, starting on January 18th. The first Scud impact sent Israeli citizens scrambling for gas masks and sealed rooms, terrified that Saddam had armed the missiles with chemical warheads. He hadn't. The missiles carried conventional explosives and killed primarily through the panic and chaos they created. But the strategic calculation was clever. Goad Israel into retaliating, which would fracture the Arab coalition and transform the war from Iraq versus world into Israel versus Arabs, the familiar dynamic where Arab states might feel compelled to support Iraq. The gambit nearly worked. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir faced enormous domestic pressure to strike back. Israeli defense doctrine had always mandated immediate, overwhelming retaliation for attacks on Israeli cities. But American pressure, combined with deployment of Patriot missile batteries to Israel and promises that coalition forces would hunt down Scud launchers aggressively, convinced Shamir to show restraint. It was an extraordinary moment, Israel absorbing attacks without responding, trusting Americans to handle it. The Great Scud Hunt became an obsession for coalition air forces, F-15E crews flying marathon missions over western Iraq's desert, searching for mobile launchers that might or might not exist, might or might not be decoys. The success rate was debatable. Many claimed kills turned out to be destroyed decoys or civilian vehicles. But the political mission succeeded. Israel stayed out, the coalition held together, and Saddam's only strategic gambit failed. By mid-February, after 38 days of continuous bombardment, the Iraqi military in Kuwait was a hollow shell. Coalition aircraft had flown over 100,000 sorties, dropped thousands of tons of munitions, and achieved air supremacy so complete that American pilots joked about getting bored, circling over Iraq, looking for targets. Iraqi command and control was shattered. Supply lines were severed. Morale among frontline troops was broken. Psychological operations, teams estimated desertion rates approaching 30% in some conscript units. The Republican Guard divisions, positioned north of Kuwait as the strategic reserve, had been pounded relentlessly by B-52s and were significantly degraded, though still capable of fighting. Schwarzkopf's air commanders reported that they'd achieved the campaign objectives. Iraqi Air Force neutralized, air defenses suppressed, military infrastructure devastated, ground forces significantly weakened. The battlefield had been prepared. The question now was whether the air campaign had been so successful that ground forces could walk into Kuwait against broken resistance, or whether Iraqi forces, dug into their elaborate defenses and still possessing chemical weapons, retained enough strength to inflict the casualties that Saddam was counting on to break American will. The only way to find out was to send in the tanks, the infantry, the Marines, and test Saddam's fortress against American armor doctrine. The air war had been spectacular, televised, a new kind of warfare. The ground war would be old-fashioned, brutal, and the true test of whether Saddam's calculation about American casualty tolerance was right or catastrophically wrong. G-Day was coming, and with it, the moment of truth for both sides. Norman Schwarzkopf stood before his commanders in late January with a mischievous grin that belied the audacity of what he was about to propose. On the map behind him, a massive left hook swept west through the empty desert. A maneuver so bold, so operationally risky, that it would either go down as one of history's great military masterstrokes or a catastrophic gamble that left American forces stranded and vulnerable in hostile territory. He called it the Hail Mary, a football reference that captured both the desperation and the magnificent improbability of moving 250,000 troops and thousands of armored vehicles 300 miles west through unmapped desert, then wheeling them north in a gigantic envelopment that would trap Iraqi forces in Kuwait like a steel vice. The maneuver required secrecy so complete that Iraqi intelligence would have to miss the largest redeployment of armored forces since World War II. It required logistics so sophisticated that fuel, ammunition, and supplies would have to be pre-positioned in empty desert. And it required that the Iraqis believe the coalition would do exactly what military orthodoxies suggested: a frontal assault into Kuwait's defenses, possibly combined with an amphibious landing. Schwarzkopf had studied military history obsessively: Patton's Third Army racing across France, Rommel's desert campaigns, Hannibal at Cannae. The lesson was clear. Great commanders didn't beat fortifications head-on. They went around them. Iraqi forces had fortified Kuwait's southern border magnificently, creating the defensive labyrinth of trenches, minefields, and fire-filled ditches that they expected would bleed coalition forces white. But they'd left their western flank virtually unguarded, assuming the open desert was impassable for large, mechanized forces. Schwarzkopf intended to prove them catastrophically wrong. 7th. Corps, the heavy armor that had defended Germany's Fulda Gap, would redeploy west, then race north into Iraq proper, cutting Highway 8 and trapping Republican Guard divisions between the westward hook and Marines pushing north through Kuwait. It was brilliant. It was risky, and it absolutely required that Iraqi intelligence believe it wasn't happening. The deception operation, codenamed Operation Berm Buster, began in earnest in early February. Marine amphibious units conducted elaborate rehearsals of beach landings along Kuwait's coast, practicing with such visible intensity that Iraqi reconnaissance couldn't miss them. 15,000 Marines of the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade loaded onto amphibious assault ships and conducted training operations in full view of Iraqi observers. Navy SEALs planted demolitions on Kuwaiti beaches at night, creating the infrastructure for a landing that would never occur. The 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit practiced helicopter assaults from ships to shore. Battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin moved into position off Kuwait's coast, their 16-inch guns, relics from World War II that could hurl 2,000 to 700-pound shells 23 miles, began bombardment of coastal defenses. Every indicator screamed that the coalition's main effort would come from the sea. Meanwhile, 7 Iraqi divisions repositioned to defend the coast, exactly as Schwarzkopf hoped. These weren't elite units, mostly conscript infantry, but they represented 70,000 troops that weren't defending against the real attack. Iraqi engineers laid additional minefields along beaches, reinforced coastal fortifications, and positioned artillery to interdict landing zones. Saddam's generals, convinced they understood American operational doctrine, prepared for a replay of Incheon or Normandy, a massive amphibious assault designed to bypass Kuwait's southern defenses. They were fighting the last war while Schwarzkopf was inventing the next one, but the amphibious feint was only part of the deception. Coalition forces conducted highly visible preparations for a frontal assault into Kuwait. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, positioned along the southern border, rehearsed breaching operations against Makkah Iraqi defenses. Engineers tested mine-clearing line charges, rockets that towed explosive cables across minefields, detonating a path through the mines when the cable exploded. The tests were conducted in daylight, ensuring Iraqi reconnaissance could photograph them. Tank battalions moved into forward positions, their movements tracked by Iraqi intelligence. Artillery units registered firing coordinates for targets in southern Kuwait. Radio traffic increased dramatically, much of it deliberately unsecured, so Iraqi signals intelligence could intercept discussions of the main assault into Kuwait. The genius of the deception was that it wasn't entirely false. Coalition forces would attack through southern Kuwait, and Marines would advance toward Kuwait City. But these attacks would be supporting efforts, fixing Iraqi forces in place, while 7th Corps executed the real war-winning maneuver far to the west. Iraqi intelligence, watching coalition preparations, saw exactly what they expected to see and missed what they weren't looking for. Moving 7 Corps west was a logistical nightmare that made D-Day planning look simple. The Corps consisted of over 1,400 tanks, 1,500 Bradley fighting vehicles, 650 artillery pieces, and 142,000 soldiers, an entire mechanized army that needed to relocate 300 miles west without Iraqi intelligence noticing. The movement began in late January and continued through mid-February, a massive armored parade through desert so empty that soldiers joked they could see the curvature of the earth. Tracked vehicles chewed up the desert floor, creating dust plumes visible for miles. Fuel trucks and supply convoys stretched across the horizon. The 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, the Big Red One, moved west. The 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions followed. The British 1st Armored Division displaced westward to anchor 7th Corps' eastern flank. The entire maneuver was executed with radio silence and at night whenever possible. But hiding 152,000 troops and thousands of vehicles in open desert wasn't truly possible. The key was making Iraqi intelligence dismiss what they saw. Schwarzkopf's intelligence staff fed the deception with carefully crafted misinformation. They allowed Iraqi agents in Saudi Arabia to discover fabricated documents suggesting the amphibious assault was the main effort. They ensured that captured Iraqi reconnaissance drone footage showed marine preparations but not 7 Corps movement. They flooded radio channels with traffic about the coastal assault, while 7 Corps communicated through secure channels or maintained radio silence. Most critically, they counted on Iraqi commanders' preconceptions that Americans would follow predictable doctrine, that the Western Desert was too difficult for large formations, that coalition forces lacked the operational sophistication for complex maneuvers. The WWII Airborne Corps, positioned even farther west than 7 Corps, faced the war's most audacious mission. The 101st Airborne Division would execute the deepest helicopter assault in history, leapfrogging 150 miles into Iraq to establish forward operating Base Cobra, cutting Highway 8 and severing Iraqi escape routes. The 24th Infantry Division, mechanized, would race north alongside them, its tanks and Bradleys covering ground at speeds that would have been impossible in European terrain. The French 6th Light Armored Division, including Foreign Legion regiments that traced their lineage to colonial desert campaigns, would protect the western flank by seizing the objective of As Salman. The entire Ejected 8 Airborne Corps operation depended on speed, surprise, and the assumption that Iraqi forces wouldn't expect such deep penetration so quickly. Pre-positioning supplies for this Western maneuver required its own minor miracle. Lieutenant General Gus Pagonis, the logistics wizard, established supply dumps at locations identified only by GPS coordinates. Log Base Charlie, Log Base Echo, isolated points in empty desert where millions of gallons of fuel, pallets of ammunition, and container after container of supplies were staged for the advancing forces. Fuel was the critical constraint. An M1A1 Abrams tank consumed 3 gallons per mile, meaning 7 Corps would burn through millions of gallons during the attack. Running out of fuel in the middle of Iraqi territory wasn't just operationally disastrous. It was potentially suicidal if Iraqi forces counterattacked isolated units. The supply dumps had to be positioned precisely, defended against potential Iraqi raids, and kept secret from reconnaissance. Iraqi intelligence wasn't entirely blind. Their reconnaissance aircraft photographed coalition buildups in the south. Their agents in Saudi Arabia reported troop movements. Their signals intelligence intercepted some communications. But they suffered from the intelligence analysts' classic trap, seeing what they expected rather than what was there. When Iraqi commanders reviewed intelligence reports of armored divisions moving west, they dismissed them as either defensive positioning or attempts to confuse Iraqi planning. The reports that did make it to Baghdad were discounted because they contradicted the prevailing strategic assessment. Americans would attack where defenses were strongest, using firepower to overcome fortifications, probably combined with an amphibious landing. The notion that coalition forces would drive through open desert, bypassing prepared defenses entirely, struck Iraqi planners as operationally reckless and logistically impossible. Saddam himself reinforced the misperception. In public statements and meetings with military commanders, he fixated on defending Kuwait, holding prepared positions, inflicting maximum casualties to break American will. The concept of mobile defensive warfare, trading space for time, counterattacking enemy penetrations, would have required acknowledging that Iraqi forces might need to retreat, an admission incompatible with Saddam's propaganda about imminent victory. So Iraqi forces stayed in their trenches, facing south, waiting for the Americans to come to them. The Republican Guard divisions, positioned as the strategic reserve north of Kuwait, represented Iraq's best forces and Saddam's only real mobile counterattack capability. The Tawakkalna Division, the Medina Division, the Hammurabi Division, these units had the training and equipment to execute maneuver warfare, but they were positioned to counterattack breakthroughs in Kuwait's defenses, not to defend against deep strikes into Iraq proper. When 7th Corps came roaring north, the Republican Guard would be out of position, reacting to threats from unexpected directions, fighting the kind of mobile armor battle where American technological advantages would be maximized. By February 23rd, the pieces were in position. 7th Corps sat coiled in the western desert, its soldiers and tankers finally understanding the operational plan they had been rehearsing in fragments. White. Airborne Corps helicopter crews studied maps of terrain they'd never seen, planning navigation routes to forward operating base Cobra. Marines along the southern border checked and rechecked their mine-clearing equipment, knowing they'd be advancing through some of the world's most elaborate minefields. The amphibious force continued its theatrical preparations, even as everyone involved knew the beaches would never see landing craft. Iraqi forces, watching and waiting, saw coalition preparations that confirmed their expectations. The massive coastal buildup, the marine positions along southern Kuwait, the artillery registrations and airstrikes, all suggested the coming assault would follow predictable patterns. Iraqi commanders felt confident. They'd prepared for this. Their defenses would extract a terrible cost. The Americans would bog down in minefields, struggle through trenches, take casualties that would shock American public opinion and force negotiations. Saddam's strategy seemed sound. Make victory so expensive that Americans would settle for something less than total Iraqi defeat. But hidden in the western desert, invisible to Iraqi intelligence, Schwarzkopf's Hail Mary was about to launch. The deception had worked perfectly. Iraqi forces were positioned to defend against attacks that were coming, but not decisive, while the war-winning blow would strike from a direction they dismissed as impossible. The parallels to historical great captains were deliberate and earned, like Hannibal enveloping the Romans at Cannae, like Patton's Third Army racing through France. The coalition was about to demonstrate that the greatest victories come not from attacking strength head-on, but from avoiding it entirely. G-Day was hours away, and with it, the test of whether Schwarzkopf's gamble was genius or disaster. At 4 a.m. on February 24th, 1991, the largest coalition ground offensive since World War II would begin, and the world would discover whether Saddam's fortress was impregnable or whether it had been built facing entirely the wrong direction. At exactly 4:00 a.m. on February 24, 1991, the desert night exploded with a thunder that hadn't been heard since the great tank battles of World War II. Hundreds of artillery pieces along the Saudi-Kuwait border opened fire simultaneously. M109 self-propelled howitzers, M198 towed guns, multiple launch rocket systems sending entire salvos of rockets screaming toward Iraqi positions. The bombardment was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize, to shatter whatever morale remained in Iraqi frontline troops who'd endured 38 days of relentless air attacks. Staff Sergeant Joe Bove, watching from his Bradley fighting vehicle, later described it as the entire horizon turning orange, like someone had turned on a light switch that stretched for miles. The psychological operations teams had dropped leaflets for weeks promising this moment, and now it arrived with apocalyptic fury. 30 minutes into the barrage, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions began their assault into southern Kuwait. Engineers rushed forward with mine-clearing line charges, essentially rockets towing 350 feet of explosive-filled tubing that, when detonated, cleared paths through the minefields. The first Miklis, mine-clearing line charge, fired with a distinctive whoosh, the rocket arcing forward, trailing its explosive payload, then detonating with a blast that sent sand and mines skyward in a violent fountain. The explosion created a lane, 8 feet wide, barely enough for a tank to pass through. Engineers marked the cleared paths with chemical lights and markers. Then tanks and Bradleys poured through single file, vulnerable and exposed, every crew member's heart hammering with the knowledge that a missed mine could turn their vehicle into a fireball. But the resistance they encountered wasn't what anyone expected. Iraqi troops, huddled in bunkers after weeks of bombardment, emerged waving white flags, undershirts, pieces of paper, anything that might signal surrender. Some positions fought back with artillery and small arms, creating intense firefights where Marines had to suppress bunkers with tank fire and grenades. But entire companies surrendered en masse, hands raised, some of them crying with relief. Captain Mike Ettinger, commanding a Marine company, radioed back in disbelief. "We've got hundreds of prisoners and we haven't been in country for an hour." The elaborate defensive fortifications that were supposed to be impenetrable were manned by conscripts who'd been starved, bombed, and abandoned by their officers. Many hadn't eaten in days. Some begged for water before they'd even been processed as prisoners. The mine-clearing operations, expected to be the deadliest part of the breach, proved remarkably successful due to technology and tactics developed specifically for this battle. M1A1 Abrams tanks equipped with mine plows, massive blade attachments that pushed aside mines rather than detonating them, bulldozed paths through fields that Iraqi engineers had spent months laying. The plows worked. Mines tumbled harmlessly aside as 70-ton tanks rumbled forward. When tanks did hit mines, the blowout panels designed into the M1A1's ammunition storage worked as advertised. The explosion vented upward rather than into the crew compartment. Tank crews that hit mines suffered concussions and terror, but often survived in vehicles that, in earlier wars, would have been metal coffins. The fire trenches, Iraq's ingenious innovation that was supposed to stop armor with walls of flame, fizzled into ineffectiveness. Some were never ignited because Iraqi engineers had fled their positions. Those that were lit created dramatic footage that television cameras loved. Black smoke billowing thousands of feet into the air, flames licking across the desert. But Marine combat engineers simply bulldozed sand into the trenches, smothering the fires, or tanks drove through gaps while crews buttoned up and endured a few seconds of intense heat. The psychological terror of driving through fire proved worse than the actual danger. Crews emerged shaken but unharmed, their thermal coatings protecting them from burns. By mid-morning on G-Day, the 1st Marine Division had penetrated 15 miles into Kuwait, sweeping past bunkers and fortifications with stunning speed. The 2nd Marine Division, attacking to the east, made similar progress. Iraqi artillery fired sporadically. Some units fought with determination. Others abandoned their guns and fled. The chemical weapons that every coalition soldier feared, the nerve gas and mustard agents that had haunted training exercises and nightmares, never materialized. Iraqi forces either lacked the capability to deliver chemical strikes effectively, or Saddam had been deterred by threats of overwhelming retaliation, or the command and control system was so degraded that orders to use chemical weapons never reached frontline units. Coalition troops advanced in MOP suits for the first hours, sweltering in chemical protection gear, before commanders made the risky decision to reduce readiness posture. The gamble paid off. No chemical attacks came. Far to the west, 16th Airborne Corps launched its own assault into Iraq proper. Not Kuwait, but Iraqi territory itself. A direct invasion that violated every conventional wisdom about Middle Eastern politics. The French 6th Light Armored Division, with its Foreign Legion regiments and AMX-30 tanks, raced toward the objective of As Salman airfield, encountering light resistance from scattered Iraqi units that seemed genuinely shocked to find French armor appearing in the middle of nowhere. The French overwhelmed the airfield defenders in a brief, violent engagement, establishing the western anchor of the coalition advance. French officers radioed triumphantly that they'd secured the objective. The extreme left flank was protected. The 101st Airborne's helicopter assault represented the single most ambitious airmobile operation in military history. At dawn on February 24th, hundreds of UH-60 Black Hawk and CH-47 Chinook helicopters lifted off from bases near the Saudi border, flying in massive formations toward landing zones 150 miles inside Iraq. AH-64 Apache gunships flew escort, their 30mm cannons and Hellfire missiles ready to suppress any resistance. The helicopters flew low and fast, pilots navigating by GPS and terrain features, the desert floor blurring beneath them. Sergeant First Class Mike Durant, flying one of the lead Black Hawks, later described the sensation. "You're flying in formation, with hundreds of helicopters, all heading into enemy territory, and the only thing you can think is, this is either going to be the greatest victory or the greatest disaster in Army aviation history." The 101st established forward operating base Cobra, a bare dirt airfield in empty desert that, within hours, became a functioning military base complete with fuel bladders, ammunition stocks, and air traffic control. From Cobra, the 101st could project helicopter power across southern Iraq, interdicting Highway 8 and cutting Iraqi forces' primary escape route north toward Basra. It was a masterpiece of air assault doctrine, executed with precision that would have been impossible a decade earlier. But the real test was sustainability. Could FOB Cobra be supplied fast enough to support ongoing operations? Massive Chinook helicopters began a continuous shuttle of fuel and ammunition from Saudi Arabia, creating an aerial supply line that defied conventional logistics. The 24th Infantry Division, mechanized, advancing alongside the 101st but on the ground, encountered almost no resistance initially. Their M1A1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles raced north at 40 miles per hour, speeds considered reckless in peacetime training but essential to maintain operational momentum. The division's mission was to drive deep, cut Highway 8, and prevent Republican Guard forces from escaping north. They covered ground at rates that stunned even optimistic planners. Tank crews navigated by GPS, the first major ground war where satellite navigation was standard, allowing them to drive through featureless desert without getting lost. The 24th's commander, Major General Barry McCaffrey, urged his forces forward relentlessly. "Speed is security. The faster we move, the less time Iraqis have to organize resistance." But the real sledgehammer, 7th Corps, hadn't yet attacked. Schwarzkopf deliberately held them back for 24 hours, waiting to ensure that Iraqi forces committed their reserves to stopping the Marine advance through Kuwait before unleashing the main effort. The delay was agonizing for 7th Corps troops who watched other units advance while they waited. Lieutenant General Frederick Franks, commanding 7th Corps, understood the operational logic but chafed at the restraint. His units, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, the 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, the British 1st Armored Division, represented the coalition's heaviest punch. Over 1,400 main battle tanks waiting to smash through Iraqi defenses and destroy the Republican Guard. By the end of G-Day, the scope of the rout was becoming clear. Marines had advanced 20 miles into Kuwait, taking thousands of prisoners. 1st Airborne Corps had penetrated 100-plus miles into Iraq, establishing positions that Iraqi commanders hadn't dreamed possible. Iraqi defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks had collapsed in hours. The elaborate fortifications were either unmanned or defended by soldiers who surrendered at first opportunity. Iraqi artillery, rather than creating the killing fields Saddam promised, fired sporadically before crews abandoned their guns. The prisoner situation became almost comical in its scale. Coalition forces had planned for 10,000 prisoners in the first 48 hours. By the end of G-Day, they'd captured over 15,000, and the flood was just beginning. Processing centers were overwhelmed. MPs ran out of forms. Some Iraqi units surrendered to helicopters, waving white flags at passing aircraft. Others tried to surrender to journalists, creating surreal scenes of reporters radioing for military police to collect prisoners. The most famous incident involved an Italian film crew that found itself accepting the surrender of an entire Iraqi company. 300 soldiers who decided that captivity with Europeans beat dying for Kuwait. Coalition casualties were miraculously light. The Marine divisions had suffered a handful of killed and dozens wounded, tragic for the families involved, but nothing like the thousands of casualties that planners had feared. The worst single incident involved a barracks in Saudi Arabia hit by an Iraqi Scud missile on G-Day. 28 soldiers killed, mostly Army reservists from Pennsylvania. The Scud that killed them had been fired randomly towards Saudi logistics bases, a desperate final gesture of defiance that achieved nothing militarily but inflicted real human tragedy. The victims' names would be read at memorial services, reminders that even lopsided victories extract costs measured in ruined families and empty chairs at dinner tables. As night fell on February 24th, Schwarzkopf reviewed the initial reports with cautious optimism that bordered on disbelief. The first day had exceeded even optimistic projections. Iraqi defenses were crumbling faster than anyone predicted. The air campaign had been more devastating than bomb damage assessments suggested. Iraqi morale was shattered. But the Republican Guard hadn't been engaged yet. Those divisions remained the unknown variable, and 7th Corps' massive armored assault was still to come. The Hail Mary play was in motion, but the game wasn't won until the Republican Guard was destroyed. As coalition forces dug into their advanced positions, soldiers cleaned weapons, ate MREs, and tried to process what they'd experienced. Many had expected a bloodbath, a replay of Vietnam or worse. Instead, they'd witnessed something unprecedented, a modern mechanized army disintegrating, almost on contact, surrendering en masse, fleeing in panic. The question now was whether this pattern would hold when coalition forces encountered Iraq's best troops, or whether the real war was just beginning. Tomorrow, 7th Corps would find out. The steel vise was closing, and somewhere north of Kuwait, Republican Guard tank commanders were finally realizing they were in the wrong positions, facing the wrong direction, about to fight a battle they'd never trained for against an enemy whose technological superiority they'd fatally underestimated. At dawn on February 25th, 7th Corps, the coalition's mailed fist, finally unleashed itself into the Iraqi desert with a roar that announced the end of defensive Cold War posturing and the beginning of offensive armored warfare on a scale unseen since the Third Reich's collapse. The 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, the 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, and the British 1st Armored Division rolled north in formation so massive that Iraqi scouts who witnessed them radioed reports their commanders dismissed as panic-induced hallucinations. Over 1,400 main battle tanks and 2,500 Bradley fighting vehicles advanced in echelons that stretched across miles of desert, their turbine engines creating a continuous thunder that soldiers compared to standing near an airport runway during rush hour. This wasn't a probing attack or a limited incursion. This was industrial-scale, mechanized warfare, the kind of armored blitzkrieg that NATO had spent 40 years preparing to execute against Soviet tank armies in Central Europe. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 7th. Corps' eyes and ears led the advance as the screening force. Their mission was to find the Republican Guard, fix them in place, and call in the heavy divisions to deliver the killing blow. The Cav moved fast and light. Squadrons of M1A1 Abrams and M3 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles racing north at speeds that left supply trucks struggling to keep up. They navigated through a sandstorm that reduced visibility to near zero, what soldiers called a shamal. Desert winds that turned the air into a brown soup of suspended grit that clogged filters, coated equipment, and made breathing feel like inhaling sandpaper. The thermal sights on American tanks and Bradleys cut through the sandstorm like magic. Iraqi tanks relying on optical sights were blind, while American gunners could see heat signatures clear as daylight. It was the ultimate unfair fight, and the technological advantage was about to be demonstrated with brutal clarity. The 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead and veteran of countless Cold War exercises, sliced into Iraq with the 1st Brigade in the lead. Their objective was the Republican Guard's Tawakalna Division, dug in along what would become known as the 73 Easting, a north-south grid line on military maps that would join names like Belleau Wood and Kasserine Pass in the annals of American armor combat. Colonel Randolph House, commanding the division's lead brigade, had drilled his tank battalions relentlessly on shoot-and-move tactics, on coordinated fires, on maintaining formation integrity, even at high speeds. His tankers were about to put that training to the ultimate test against T-72 tanks, operated by Iraq's supposedly elite forces. Meanwhile, far to the west, the 24th Infantry Division was executing what would later be recognized as one of the most remarkable advances in mechanized warfare history. Major General Barry McCaffrey's division raced north through empty desert at a pace that defied conventional military wisdom. Tank companies covered 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles in a day, not on roads, but cross-country through trackless desert where navigation was by GPS and dead reckoning. The M1A1 Abrams, powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine, could sustain highway speeds across terrain that would have immobilized earlier generation tanks. One company commander described it as driving a Cadillac at 40 miles per hour across the world's largest dirt parking lot. The logistical challenge of sustaining this advance bordered on the impossible. Each M1A1 consumed 3 gallons of fuel per mile. A battalion of 58 tanks burned through 10,000 gallons covering 60 miles. The fuel trucks, heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, HHMTTs, carrying 2,500 gallons each, raced forward in continuous shuttles from Log Base Echo and Log Base Charlie. Fuel points were established in the middle of nowhere, GPS coordinates where tankers would find fuel trucks waiting. The system worked through a combination of meticulous planning and improvisation. When GPS coordinates were off, scouts would fire colored smoke grenades to mark fuel points. The entire division moved like a vast, fuel-hungry organism, consuming petroleum at rates that would have bankrupted a small nation. The 101st Airborne, operating from Forward Operating Base Cobra, was conducting an air assault campaign that redefined helicopter warfare. AH-64 Apaches ranged across southern Iraq, hunting Iraqi convoys attempting to flee north on Highway 8. The Apache, ugly and lethal, proved to be the perfect tank killer. Its longbow radar could detect armor at ranges where Iraqi tankers couldn't even see the helicopter, and Hellfire missiles destroyed T-72s with surgical precision. Chief Warrant Officer David Jones, flying an Apache from the 101st, described the one-sided nature of the engagement. "We could see them on thermals, hovering 5 kilometers away. They never knew we were there until the hellfires hit. It wasn't combat, it was execution." But the Apaches discovered their own vulnerability when Iraqi forces got lucky. Chief Warrant Officer David Jones and his crew were shot down by Iraqi ground fire on February 26th, becoming one of the few Apache losses of the war. They survived the crash and were captured, becoming POWs who would endure brutal treatment before eventual release. The incident served as a reminder that even overwhelming technological superiority didn't eliminate risk entirely. Wars are still fought by humans and machines, and humans bleed regardless of how advanced their equipment. The British 1st Armoured Division, anchoring 7th Corps' eastern flank, advanced with typical British methodical precision. Their Challenger tanks, equipped with rifled 120mm guns and heavy armour, proved magnificently lethal against Iraqi armour. The British doctrine emphasized deliberate advances with overwatching fire support, a contrast to American emphasis on speed. But the results were equally devastating. Iraqi positions were identified, suppressed with artillery, then destroyed by tank fire before the British advanced to the next phase line. One British tank commander, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Denaro, of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, would later describe the advance as the most perfect execution of armored doctrine I've witnessed. "We were destroying Iraqi positions faster than they could organize resistance." The first major engagement came on February 26th, when the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment stumbled into elements of the Tawakkalna Division near the 73 Easting. The Iraqis were dug into prepared positions, hull down in revetments, with infantry support and artillery. Under normal circumstances, attacking such positions required careful preparation, artillery suppression, and accepting significant casualties. But these weren't normal circumstances. American tanks emerged from the sandstorm like mechanical ghosts, their thermal sights identifying Iraqi positions before Iraqi gunners even knew Americans were there. Eagle Troop, E Company of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, smashed into Iraqi positions with Captain H.R. McMaster commanding. The 25-year-old West Point graduate would later become a 3-star general and national security advisor. But on February 26, 1991, he was a cavalry officer, fighting the battle of his life. His 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks, supported by Bradley fighting vehicles, engaged Republican Guard armor at ranges where American thermal sights gave them overwhelming advantage. Staff Sergeant Nels Muller, gunner in McMaster's tank, described the almost video game unreality of the engagement. "I could see the Iraqi tanks clear as day on thermals. They were just sitting there, completely unaware. I ranged, fired, hit. Moved to the next target. Ranged, fired, hit. It was methodical." The Battle of 73. Easting lasted approximately 4 hours and resulted in the destruction of approximately 160 Iraqi armored vehicles, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, trucks, and artillery pieces. Eagle Troop alone destroyed 28 tanks and 16 personnel carriers without suffering a single loss. American tanks engaged at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, distances where Iraqi return fire was wildly inaccurate when it came at all. The technology gap was so enormous that it resembled not a battle between equals, but a massacre of obsolete equipment by next-generation weapons systems. Iraqi tankers, many of them veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, found that experience meant nothing when facing enemies they couldn't see who killed them from ranges they couldn't match. But 73 Easting also revealed that Republican Guard units, unlike the conscript forces in Kuwait, would fight when cornered. Iraqi infantry engaged with RPGs and small arms. Some T-72 crews attempted to maneuver and return fire, though with limited success. Iraqi artillery delivered fire missions, forcing American forces to button up and maneuver under indirect fire. A handful of Bradley fighting vehicles were damaged by RPG fire. The fighting was intense enough that American ammunition expenditure exceeded pre-battle estimates. Tanks were firing 20, 30, sometimes 40 main gun rounds in engagements that doctrine suggested should require fewer than 10. As 7th Corps smashed through Iraqi positions, the scale of destruction became almost incomprehensible. The 1st Infantry Division, attacking through Iraqi minefields and fortifications with their mine plow-equipped tanks, created breaches that other units poured through. The 3rd Armored Division destroyed entire battalions of Iraqi armor. The British engaged the Medina Division's Armored Brigade, killing dozens of T-72s in engagements that British tankers described as unsporting. The thermal sight advantage was so complete that Iraqis died without ever acquiring targets. The 24th Infantry Division, reaching Highway 8 on February 26th, established blocking positions that severed the Republican Guard's retreat route to Basra. They were now 250 miles inside Iraq, farther than any American ground forces had penetrated into hostile territory since World War II. McCaffrey's tankers and infantrymen dug into hasty defensive positions, expecting Republican Guard counterattacks that never materialized. Instead, Iraqi convoys attempting to flee north ran directly into 24th Division positions, creating turkey shoots where American tanks destroyed supply trucks, fuel tankers, and occasional armored vehicles attempting to escape the envelopment. The French Foreign Legion, holding the far western flank, encountered light resistance but accomplished their mission of protecting Sistine Haute, airborne corps from any Iraqi forces attempting to attack from the west. The Legionnaires, many of them hardened veterans of African colonial campaigns, found the desert familiar but the enemy weak, scattered Iraqi units that surrendered or fled rather than fighting. One French officer radioed back with typical Gallic dry humor. "We have secured the flank. The enemy is running faster than we can advance." By nightfall on February 26th, the envelopment was nearly complete. 7th Corps had penetrated deep into Iraq, smashing through Republican Guard positions with losses so minimal they seemed almost miraculous. 68th Airborne Corps controlled Highway 8, blocking escape routes north. Marines were pushing toward Kuwait City from the south. The steel vise had closed, trapping Iraqi forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq with nowhere to retreat. Iraqi command and control had completely collapsed. Divisions couldn't communicate with Corps headquarters, Corps couldn't reach Baghdad, and Saddam's orders, when they came, were hopelessly out of touch with battlefield reality. The Republican Guard, Iraq's elite force that was supposed to be the military equal of Western armies, was being systematically destroyed. The Tawakkalna Division had been effectively annihilated. The Medina Division was heavily engaged and taking catastrophic losses. The Hammurabi Division was attempting to retreat north, but would soon run into coalition blocking positions. The technological disparity, thermal sights versus optical sights, GPS navigation versus map and compass, turbine engines versus diesels, composite armor versus steel, had created a killing field where Iraqi forces died without being able to effectively fight back. Schwarzkopf, watching the battle unfold from his Riyadh headquarters, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Hail Mary had worked. The deception had been perfect. The left hook had crushed Iraqi forces with a speed and completeness that exceeded even optimistic projections. But he also recognized that the window for destruction was closing. Iraqi forces were fleeing en masse, racing north toward Basra and the Rumaila oil fields. If he wanted to destroy the Republican Guard completely, rather than simply defeating them, he needed to maintain pressure, to keep the 7th Corps advancing, to trap and annihilate Iraqi forces before they could escape across the Euphrates River into Iraq proper. The question was how much more destruction was necessary to achieve the mission objectives, and at what point did victory become massacre? That decision would come soon. as the world watched Highway 80 transform into what media would dub the Highway of Death, a 6-lane graveyard of destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment that would crystallize the moral ambiguity of overwhelming military victory. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Dick White, piloting an A-10 Warthog over southern Kuwait on the night of February 26th, spotted something that made him radio for confirmation that his targeting computer wasn't malfunctioning. Below him, stretching north from Kuwait City toward Basra for what appeared to be 20 or 30 miles, was a solid ribbon of vehicle lights. A traffic jam of epic proportions illuminated against the darkness. Highway 80, the main artery connecting Kuwait to Iraq, had become a parking lot of fleeing Iraqi forces. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, civilian cars, military trucks, stolen Kuwaiti vehicles loaded with looted televisions and air conditioners, even city buses crammed with soldiers, all of them crawling bumper to bumper in desperate flight toward the Iraqi border. Iraqi troops, having received orders to evacuate Kuwait, or simply making the rational decision that staying meant death, had abandoned their positions and joined a chaotic retreat that had overwhelmed the highway's capacity. What happened next would become one of the war's most controversial episodes, generating images that would haunt the conflict's legacy and contribute to President Bush's decision to end the ground war after just 100 hours. Coalition aircraft, A-10 Warthogs, F-15E Strike Eagles, FA-18 Hornets, British Tornadoes, descended on the convoy with devastating precision. The tactic was brutally effective. Destroy the lead vehicles to block the highway, destroy the rear vehicles to trap the convoy, then systematically work through everything in between. A-10 pilots, flying low and slow, unleashed their GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannons, a 7-barrel rotary weapon that fired depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, a deep brrrr-tee that tanker crews compared to fabric tearing on a cosmic scale. The depleted uranium rounds punched through tank armor like it was aluminum foil, igniting ammunition and fuel in spectacular secondary explosions. Captain Steve Pingle, flying an A-10 from the 23rd Tactical Fighter Wing, later described the scene with clinical detachment that barely masked horror. You could see vehicles trying to maneuver around destroyed ones, then they get hit and block the road further. Soldiers were abandoning vehicles, running into the desert. Some were trying to return fire with anti-aircraft guns, but they were shooting blind. It was chaos. The night sky lit up with explosions, fuel trucks detonating in orange fireballs, ammunition trucks creating sustained fireworks, displays as ordnance cooked off, civilian vehicles burning alongside military hardware in a conflagration that turned night into apocalyptic daylight. By dawn on February 27th, Highway 80 resembled a graveyard of steel and rubber, stretching for miles. Approximately 1,400 to 2,000 vehicles. The exact count varied depending on who was counting and what qualified as a vehicle versus a burned-out hulk. Sat destroyed, abandoned, or damaged beyond repair. Many were military. T-72 tanks with their turrets blown off, BMP infantry carriers burned to hollow shells, fuel trucks reduced to twisted metal frames. But interspersed among the military hardware were civilian vehicles, Mercedes sedans stolen from Kuwaiti citizens, city buses that had been commandeered for troop transport, civilian trucks loaded with looted goods that Iraqi soldiers had intended to take home as spoils of war. The human toll remained unclear and would become the subject of intense debate. Unlike the sterile video game imagery of precision strikes on buildings, Highway 80 presented graphic evidence of combat's reality. Bodies burned beyond recognition, soldiers who'd been incinerated in their vehicles, others who'd fled into the desert and died from wounds or exposure. American pilots reported that many Iraqis had abandoned vehicles and fled before strikes arrived. The bombing created a traffic jam that preceded the actual destruction, giving occupants time to escape. But some hadn't been so lucky, or had stayed with their vehicles trying to move forward, or had been trapped when vehicles ahead and behind were destroyed. The photographs taken the next day by journalists shocked international audiences. Tony Perry of the Los Angeles Times walked the highway and described a scene from Dante's Inferno. Charred bodies in the driver's seats of civilian cars, soldiers' remains scattered alongside looted consumer goods. The grotesque juxtaposition of war's brutality with consumerism's detritus. Brand new televisions sitting beside corpses, air conditioners melted into unrecognizable lumps, jewelry and electronics mixed with weapons and ammunition. The imagery was politically devastating for coalition forces trying to maintain the narrative of a clean, surgical war, fought with precision weapons against military targets. What complicated the moral calculus was the looting. Iraqi forces had spent months systematically pillaging Kuwait, not just strategic assets, but consumer goods, personal property, cultural artifacts. Kuwaiti citizens had been murdered, raped, tortured. The Iraqi retreat wasn't a defeated army withdrawing in good order. It was a force of looters fleeing with their stolen goods. Did that make them legitimate military targets? Coalition commanders argued yes. These were Iraqi military forces in military vehicles, interspersed with stolen civilian property. Critics argued the images suggested something closer to a massacre than a military operation, especially given the one-sided nature of the destruction. The legal and moral questions were genuinely complex. Under the laws of war, retreating forces remained legitimate targets. Retreat doesn't confer immunity from attack. Iraqi forces on Highway 80 were armed, organized units under military command, even if their retreat was chaotic. The looted goods didn't change their military status. But the visual impact of the destruction, combined with reports of coalition aircraft continuing to strike even after organized resistance had collapsed, created the impression of unnecessary slaughter. Marine Captain Ron Richard, whose unit reached the highway after the strikes, expressed the moral ambiguity that many felt. They were legitimate targets. They were enemy soldiers retreating with military equipment. But seeing the destruction up close, the burned bodies, the abandoned personal effects, made you question whether we needed to hit them that hard. A separate incident on Highway 8, running north from Basra toward Baghdad, created similar scenes. The 24th Infantry Division, blocking this escape route, engaged Iraqi columns attempting to flee. Unlike Highway 80, where air power did most of the killing, Highway 8 saw combined arms engagement, tanks firing from blocking positions, Apache helicopters engaging from multiple directions, artillery dropping rounds on concentrated vehicle columns. The result was equally devastating. Hundreds of destroyed vehicles, thousands of Iraqi soldiers killed or captured, and scenes of destruction that rivaled Highway 80's carnage. President Bush, watching television coverage from the White House, saw the images and understood immediately that public support for the war, never guaranteed to last long even under the best circumstances, was approaching its limit. The footage of Highway 80, combined with estimates that Iraq had suffered over 100,000 casualties while coalition forces had lost fewer than 300 killed, created a public relations problem that threatened to transform military victory into political liability. The phrase, "Turkey shoot," started appearing in news coverage, a term that suggested unsporting slaughter rather than legitimate military operations. Schwarzkopf faced a decision point. 7th Corps was still advancing, still destroying Republican Guard units, still finding targets. Iraqi forces were fleeing in complete disarray, but fleeing wasn't the same as being destroyed. If the mission was to eliminate Iraq's military threat to the region, then continuing the pursuit made sense. Why stop when the enemy was broken and vulnerable? But if the mission was to liberate Kuwait and demonstrate that aggression wouldn't be tolerated, then that objective had been achieved. continuing to kill fleeing Iraqis, even if legally justified, risked turning battlefield victory into political disaster. Colin Powell, back in Washington, was watching the same images and doing political calculations. The Powell Doctrine emphasized overwhelming force, clear objectives, and knowing when to stop. Kuwait was liberated. Iraqi military power was shattered. The Republican Guard had been defeated, even if not completely annihilated. Saddam's army would take years to rebuild. Coalition casualties were miraculously light. The conflict was on track to be the most lopsided military victory in modern history. Why risk squandering that success by continuing operations that would generate more images like Highway 80? Bush convened his national security team on the evening of February 27th. The discussion focused on a single question: when to stop? Schwarzkopf wanted more time, another 24 to 48 hours to complete the destruction of the Republican Guard, to ensure that Iraqi military power was so thoroughly demolished that Saddam couldn't threaten the region for a generation. Powell argued for stopping soon. The military objectives had been achieved, and continuing operations was generating diminishing returns while increasing political costs. Cheney noted that the coalition, particularly Arab members, was getting nervous about the scope of Iraqi casualties and American forces penetrating deep into Iraq proper. The decision came down to symbolism and mathematics. Bush wanted a clean number, something that resonated, that captured the swift and decisive nature of the victory. 100 hours. Just over 4 days from the start of the ground campaign. It was arbitrary, but it was memorable. It satisfied the political need for a clear endpoint while giving Schwarzkopf's forces enough time to complete most operational objectives. At 8 a.m. on February 28th, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began, the ceasefire would take effect. Schwarzkopf was furious when he learned of the decision. His forces were still in contact with Iraqi units. The Hammurabi Division, one of the Republican Guard's premier formations, was attempting to escape across the causeway at the Hawar al-Hamr Lagoon and could be trapped and destroyed if given more time. 7th Corps was poised to complete the envelopment, to annihilate rather than merely defeat Iraqi forces. Stopping now left the job incomplete. He argued vehemently with Powell. "We have them. Another 48 hours and we destroy the entire Republican Guard." Powell was sympathetic, but firm. The president had decided. The ceasefire announcement went out to coalition forces late on February 27th. Hostilities would cease at 8 a.m. local time on February 28th. Commanders had hours to accomplish whatever final objectives they could. The remaining time saw frantic operations as units raced to destroy as much Iraqi equipment and capture as much territory as possible before the deadline. The 24th Infantry Division engaged the Hammurabi Division in a running battle around the Hawar al-Hamr causeway, destroying dozens of tanks in the final hours. British forces pushed forward to maximize territorial gains. Marines consolidated their hold on Kuwait City. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment continued destroying Iraqi positions until the final minutes. At precisely 8 a.m. on February 28, 1991, the guns fell silent. Coalition forces halted in place, some of them literally mid-advance, tracks churning to a stop as orders came down to cease all offensive operations. Iraqi forces, or what remained of them, stopped fleeing and began the process of surrender or dissolution. Soldiers on both sides emerged from vehicles, from bunkers, from defensive positions, and tried to process what had just happened. The war, the shooting war at least, was over after just 100 hours of ground combat. The final accounting was staggering in its one-sidedness. Coalition forces had lost 292 killed in action, tragic for every family involved, but a number so low it seemed almost miraculous given the scale of operations. Iraqi casualties remained disputed. Estimates ranged from 20,000 to 50,000 killed. with tens of thousands more wounded and over 80,000 taken prisoner. The Iraqi military had been functionally destroyed. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces wrecked or captured. Air force annihilated, command structure shattered, logistics completely broken. But Highway 80's images would linger long after the victory parades ended. They represented the moral complexity of overwhelming military superiority. Was it victory or overkill? Were Iraqi forces on that highway legitimate military targets or victims of disproportionate force? The debate would continue for years, with historians, ethicists, and veterans arguing different interpretations. What was undeniable was that those images, more than precision bombing footage or liberation celebrations, captured something essential about modern warfare. That technological superiority could create victories so lopsided they generated their own moral questions. That winning decisively could still feel unsettling, and that even the cleanest war involved scenes of carnage that challenged comfortable narratives about surgical strikes and bloodless victories. As coalition forces established ceasefire positions and began processing prisoners, sorting equipment, and accounting for their own casualties, a different realization was settling in. The shooting had stopped, but the war's consequences were just beginning. Kuwait was liberated but devastated. Iraqi military power was shattered, but Saddam remained in power. The coalition had won decisively, but incompletely. And in the coming days, as Shiite and Kurdish uprisings erupted across Iraq, expecting American support that wouldn't come, the decision to stop at 100 hours would take on new and uncomfortable dimensions. While Highway 80 captured the war's moral ambiguity, the Battle of 73 Easting on February 26, 1991, represented something else entirely. The most technologically advanced tank-on-tank engagement in history, a 4-hour masterclass in armored warfare that would be studied at military academies for decades. Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop, just 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 13 Bradley fighting vehicles from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, had stumbled into defensive positions held by the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakkalna Division, arguably Iraq's best-trained, best-equipped force. What followed was a battle that demonstrated the revolution in military technology with a clarity that no amount of Pentagon briefings could match. The engagement began around 4:15 p.m. in the middle of a raging sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. Iraqi forces, dug into prepared positions along a low ridgeline, couldn't see 50 feet in front of them. The brown soup of suspended sand had turned afternoon into apocalyptic twilight. But Eagle Troop's thermal imaging systems cut through the sandstorm like it didn't exist. Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, gunner in Lieutenant John Gifford's tank, described the surreal advantage. "I could see Iraqi tanks clear as day on my thermals, their heat signatures glowing white against the cool desert background. They had no idea we were there. It was like hunting with night vision goggles against someone stumbling around in pitch darkness." McMaster, a West Point graduate who'd written his senior thesis on the failures of American generalship in Vietnam, understood he was experiencing the opposite extreme. Technological overmatch so complete it bordered on unfair. But there was nothing sporting about war, and the Iraqis had chosen their positions well. Hull down in revetments, infantry dug in with anti-tank weapons, artillery pre-sighted on likely avenues of approach. In a fair fight, attacking such positions would be suicidal. But this wasn't a fair fight. American tanks could engage at 2,500 meters with first-round kill probability, exceeding 90%. Iraqi T-72s, equipped with optical sights obscured by sandstorm, were effectively blind beyond a few hundred meters. The battle opened when Eagle Troop crested a small rise, and McMaster's tank commander, Sergeant Jeffrey Taylor spotted multiple Iraqi positions through his thermal sight. McMaster made an instant decision that would be dissected in after-action reviews. Attack immediately, rather than calling for artillery or waiting for the rest of the squadron. His reasoning was simple. In the sandstorm, coordination would be nearly impossible, and the element of surprise was perishable. Contact front! The traditional cavalry call to action crackled across the radio, followed by grid coordinates and target descriptions. 9 American tanks opened fire almost simultaneously. Staff Sergeant Muller, McMaster's gunner, engaged the first T-72 at 2,200 meters, a range where Iraqi return fire would be wildly inaccurate, even in perfect visibility. The 120mm smoothbore gun recoiled, the spent shell casing ejecting automatically, and 2 seconds later, the Iraqi tank exploded as the sabot round, a depleted uranium dart traveling at 1,750 meters per second, punched through armor and ignited ammunition. Muller didn't pause to celebrate. He was already traversing to the next target. Identified! Tank! The loader slammed another round into the breach. Up! McMaster confirmed the target. Fire! The gun roared again. Another Iraqi tank erupted in flames. The rhythm became mechanical. Identify, range, fire, hit, next target. Muller would fire 21 main gun rounds in the next 4 hours. 21 shots, 19 confirmed kills or catastrophic damages. But the Iraqis weren't rolling over. Republican Guard crews, realizing they were under attack, began returning fire, even though they couldn't see their attackers. T-72 main guns flashed in the sandstorm, their rounds sailing past Eagle troops' positions or impacting harmlessly in the sand. A few rounds came dangerously close. One Iraqi round passed between 2 American tanks with less than 10 feet of clearance, close enough that both crews felt the shockwave. Sergeant Patrick Ewell's Bradley was hit by a T-72 round that struck at an angle and deflected off the sloped armor. The crew felt the impact like being inside a bell that had been struck with a sledgehammer, their ears ringing, but the Bradley kept fighting. The Bradley fighting vehicles proved their worth in ways their critics had never anticipated. Armed with 25mm Bushmaster chain guns and Tiao anti-tank missiles, the Bradleys engaged Iraqi infantry positions while also destroying lighter, armored vehicles. Specialist Troy Spicer, gunner in one Bradley, methodically suppressed Iraqi infantry bunkers with 25mm high explosive rounds that airburst on impact, shredding anyone caught in the open. When an Iraqi BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle emerged from a revetment attempting to flank Eagle troops' position, Spicer put a Tau missile through its front slope at 2,000 meters. The wire-guided missile tracked perfectly, impacting with a flash that left the BMP burning. The 4-hour battle became a running engagement as Eagle Troop advanced through the Iraqi defensive belt. Ghost Troop and Iron Troop from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment joined the fight, expanding the engagement into a squadron-level battle. The thermal sight advantage remained absolute. American gunners could see Iraqi positions, Iraqi crew members moving around vehicles, even individual infantry soldiers. One American gunner reported seeing an Iraqi tank crew member climbing out of his turret hatch through thermals, then watching him scramble back inside seconds before an American sabot round destroyed the tank. The Iraqis attempted a counterattack around 6:01 p.m., Republican Guard armor moving forward from reserve positions to reinforce the defensive line. It was a tactically sound decision that became a suicide mission. Iraqi tanks advancing in formation presented ideal targets for American gunners who'd been training on exactly this scenario for years. Lieutenant Jeff DeStefano's platoon engaged 6 T-72s in less than 3 minutes, destroying all 6 before they could bring effective fire to bear. The Iraqi formation disintegrated, some tanks attempting to retreat, others stopping to return fire. a few crew members abandoning their vehicles and running into the desert. By nightfall, the sandstorm had begun to clear, and what American forces saw through their thermal sights was apocalyptic. The ridgeline that Eagle Troop had attacked was now a junkyard of burning and destroyed Iraqi equipment. Approximately 85 Iraqi armored vehicles, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry carriers, MTLB armored personnel carriers, trucks and support vehicles sat destroyed within a 2-kilometer area. Some were still burning, ammunition cooking off in intermittent explosions that sent tracer rounds arcing into the darkening sky like demonic fireworks. The battlefield was littered with abandoned equipment, dead Iraqi soldiers, and the detritus of modern mechanized combat, tread sections, blown-off turrets, personal equipment, weapons. Staff Sergeant Gary Pruitt's tank crew dismounted after the fighting stopped to inspect an Iraqi T-72 they'd destroyed. The Iraqi tank was hull down in a carefully prepared fighting position, exactly where doctrine said it should be. But the American sabot round had punched through the turret front, supposedly the most heavily armored section, and exited through the rear in a spray of molten metal that had ignited the ammunition carousel. The 3 crew members inside hadn't stood a chance. Pruitt, a veteran tanker, was sobered by the inspection. That could have been us if the technology was reversed. They did everything right tactically. Good positions, good camouflage, good fields of fire. But our equipment was just so much better that none of it mattered. The casualty disparity at 73 Easting told its own story. Eagle Troop lost 0 soldiers killed and suffered 1 wounded. A Bradley crew member hit by shrapnel when an Iraqi round detonated near his vehicle. Iraqi casualties were estimated at 600–800 killed, with unknown numbers wounded and approximately 1,300 captured in the immediate aftermath. The mathematical brutality of the exchange, over 160 Iraqi armored vehicles destroyed versus 0 American losses, represented the ultimate expression of technological overmatch in armored warfare. But technology alone didn't explain Eagle Troop's success. McMaster's aggressive decision-making, his crew's intensive training, the seamless coordination between tanks and Bradleys, the ability to maintain formation integrity while maneuvering in a sandstorm, these human factors amplified the technological advantages. Less aggressive commanders might have stopped to call for artillery, waited for the rest of the regiment, allowed Iraqi forces time to withdraw or reinforce. McMaster's instinct was to close with the enemy immediately, to exploit the shock of first contact before Iraqis could organize effective resistance. The battle also revealed limitations in American doctrine and equipment that were easy to overlook amid the lopsided victory. Some American tanks experienced targeting system glitches in the sandstorm, thermal sights that flickered or lost resolution temporarily. Radio communications were chaotic, with multiple units trying to coordinate on shared frequencies while maintaining fire discipline. The GPS systems that had revolutionized desert navigation occasionally gave questionable readings, forcing crews to rely on traditional map and compass navigation. Ammunition resupply under fire proved challenging. Eagle Troop's tanks had fired through most of their main gun ammunition and needed resupply while still in contact with enemy forces, requiring logistical vehicles to drive forward into a combat zone. The psychological impact on Iraqi survivors was devastating. Prisoners from the Tawakkalna division described fighting an enemy they never saw. Watching their vehicles explode from invisible attackers, being unable to return effective fire. Some Republican Guard soldiers among Iraq's elite forces were reduced to tears by the helplessness of the engagement. They'd expected a battle. What they got was mechanical slaughter, executed with industrial efficiency. The Republican Guard's myth of invincibility, carefully cultivated through propaganda and its performance against Iran's human wave attacks, shattered against American armor doctrine and technology. In the days following 73 Easting, military analysts descended on the battlefield to document everything. The Army's Center for Army Lessons Learned, CALL, treated it as a laboratory for studying modern armored combat. Every destroyed vehicle was catalogued. Crew members were debriefed extensively. The engagement was recreated in computer simulations that would become training tools for the next generation of armor officers. The battle became proof of concept for technologies that had been theoretical or untested: thermal sights in degraded visibility, GPS navigation in featureless terrain, digital communications in high-tempo combat, depleted uranium ammunition against advanced Soviet-designed armor. But amid the technical analysis, human stories emerged that complicated the sterile narrative of technological triumph. An American medic treating wounded Iraqi prisoners found a family photograph in one soldier's pocket, wife and children, smiling at a birthday party. Iraqi soldiers who'd fought bravely from impossible positions deserved respect even in defeat. One American tanker, describing the aftermath of the battle, captured the moral complexity. "We did our job. We won decisively. We protected each other and accomplished the mission. But walking through the battlefield afterward, seeing what our weapons did to human beings, even enemy combatants who were trying to kill us, that stays with you." Victory doesn't feel triumphant when you're stepping around bodies. The Battle of 73. Easting lasted 4 hours but represented the culmination of decades of American investment in training, technology, and doctrine. It validated the M1A1 Abrams as the world's premier main battle tank. It proved that thermal sights and GPS navigation were war-winning technologies. It demonstrated that intensive crew training and aggressive junior officer leadership could amplify technological advantages into overwhelming battlefield success. But it also revealed uncomfortable truths about modern warfare: that technological superiority could create engagements so one-sided they resembled executions more than battles, that professional soldiers could perform their duties with devastating efficiency while being haunted by the human cost of that efficiency, and that winning decisively didn't eliminate the moral weight of killing, even when that killing was legally justified and tactically necessary. As the ceasefire approached and coalition forces halted their advance, the burning hulks along the 73 Easting Ridgeline continued to smolder, sending columns of black smoke into the desert sky. The battle would become a case study, a touchstone, a moment when the revolution in military affairs transitioned from theory to demonstrated reality. But for the soldiers who fought there, it remained something more personal and less analytical. A few hours of terror and triumph, of mechanical precision and human chaos, of technological dominance and moral ambiguity, all compressed into a sandstorm-shrouded afternoon that would define the rest of their lives. At 5:30 a.m. on February 28, 1991, 90 minutes before the ceasefire would take effect, Lieutenant General Frederick Franks Jr., commanding 7th Corps, sat in his command vehicle reviewing situation maps that showed his forces still locked in combat with remnants of the Republican Guard. The Hammurabi Division, one of Iraq's most prestigious armored formations, was attempting a desperate retreat across the causeway at Hawr al-Hamar, a narrow land bridge over marshy lakes that represented one of the few remaining escape routes to Basra. Franks had elements of the 1st Infantry Division in position to interdict the crossing, and the 24th Infantry Division was closing from the west like a steel door slamming shut. Another 24 hours. Hell, another 12 hours. And he could trap and destroy the Hammurabi entirely, completing the annihilation of Iraq's elite forces. Instead, he was being ordered to stop at 8 a.m. sharp, leaving the job frustratingly incomplete. The tension between Schwarzkopf and Franks over the tempo of 7th Corps' advance had been simmering for days. Schwarzkopf wanted aggressive, rapid exploitation. He'd envisioned 7th Corps racing north to cut off the Republican Guard completely. Franks, more methodical and concerned about outrunning his logistics, had advanced deliberately, maintaining unit cohesion and ensuring his flanks were protected. Both approaches had merit. Schwarzkopf's emphasized destroying maximum enemy forces while they were vulnerable. Frank's minimized the risk of American casualties from hasty operations, but now, with the ceasefire imminent, the disagreement became academic. History would never know whether another day of operations would have achieved Schwarzkopf's vision of total Republican Guard destruction. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had called Schwarzkopf from Washington the previous evening with the president's decision. Bush wanted the war to end at 100 hours of ground combat, a clean, memorable number that satisfied both political and military considerations. Powell explained the rationale. Kuwait was liberated, Iraqi military power was shattered, coalition casualties were miraculously low, and continuing operations was generating diminishing returns while increasing political costs. The highway of death footage had rattled Washington. International opinion, especially among Arab coalition partners, was getting squeamish about the scale of Iraqi casualties. The mission had been accomplished. Time to declare victory and go home. Schwarzkopf's response was volcanic. The phone conversation, conducted on secure lines, allegedly included language that would have made a drill sergeant blush. "We're this close to destroying them completely," he reportedly shouted. "Give me 48 more hours, and there won't be a Republican Guard left." Powell, unflappable as always, let Schwarzkopf vent before calmly reiterating that the president's decision was final. The conversation ended with Schwarzkopf understanding that he'd been overruled by civilian authority, the way it was supposed to work in a democracy, however frustrating it felt to a commander with enemy forces in his sights. The final hours before ceasefire saw frantic military operations as commanders rushed to accomplish whatever objectives remained achievable. The 24th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Barry McCaffrey, engaged the Hammurabi Division in running battles around Khor al-Hamr. Apache helicopters from the division's aviation brigade hunted Iraqi armor attempting to cross the causeway, Hellfire missiles destroying tanks that were bottlenecked in the retreat. M1A1 Abrams tanks from the division's brigades established blocking positions and engaged Iraqi formations at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. Extreme distance shooting that demonstrated both the Abrams fire control system capabilities and American gunners' confidence in their equipment. One engagement epitomized the final hour's intensity. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Ritter's tank battalion from the 24th Infantry Division encountered an Iraqi brigade attempting to organize a fighting withdrawal. The Iraqis had established hasty defensive positions and were engaging American forces with artillery and tank fire. Actual military resistance, rather than the wholesale surrender that characterized much of the war. The resulting battle, fought in morning twilight with the ceasefire clock ticking down, saw American forces destroy approximately 185 Iraqi armored vehicles in less than 90 minutes. It was mechanized warfare at tempo that would have been unimaginable in earlier conflicts. Thermal sights identifying targets, laser rangefinders calculating distance, computers solving fire control equations, and 120 mm guns delivering instant death with precision that made every shot count. British forces, operating as part of 7th Corps, pushed hard in the final hours to maximize territorial gains and equipment destruction. The 1st Armored Division engaged Iraqi positions with their Challenger tanks, whose rifled 120 mm guns proved devastatingly effective. One British Challenger crew claimed a kill at 500 meters, over 3 miles, possibly the longest tank-on-tank kill in history, though the claim would remain disputed because battlefield chaos made precise measurement impossible. What was indisputable was that British armor performed magnificently, combining their traditional methodical approach with aggressive exploitation when opportunities presented themselves. Marines consolidating control of Kuwait City faced a different challenge: urban pacification and humanitarian crisis management. The city had been systematically looted, its infrastructure sabotaged, and retreating Iraqi forces had set fire to hundreds of oil wells as a final act of destruction. Black smoke from burning wellheads turned midday into twilight, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere that photographers captured in images suggesting Dante's Inferno relocated to the Arabian Peninsula. Kuwaiti citizens emerged from hiding, celebrating liberation while simultaneously processing the devastation of their country. Marines found themselves transitioning from combat operations to peacekeeping, crowd control, and humanitarian assistance, roles they'd never expected to perform hours after fighting through minefields. The prisoner situation had become almost comical in its scale. Coalition forces had captured over 80,000 Iraqi soldiers, far exceeding the capacity of field processing centers. MPs were overwhelmed. Logistics officers scrambled to feed and shelter prisoners who kept arriving in groups ranging from dozens to entire companies. Some Iraqi units marched into Saudi Arabia under their own officers, formed up in military formation, and formally surrendered in organized ceremonies that had a surreal quality given the chaos everywhere else. Other prisoners were simply directed to assembly areas and told to wait for processing. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care, obligations that coalition forces took seriously even as the sheer numbers strained resources. As WWII approached, word spread through coalition units that the ceasefire was imminent. Soldiers had mixed reactions. Relief was universal. Even in a lopsided victory, combat was terrifying, and every hour carried the risk of being the unlucky casualty who died in a war's final moments. But there was also frustration, especially among officers who understood operational objectives. Tank commanders could see Iraqi forces escaping, targets that would cease to be targetable at 8:00 a.m. Artillery officers had firing solutions on Iraqi positions that would go unengaged. The military mind, trained to pursue victory to the point of enemy annihilation, struggled with the political decision to stop while targets remained. At precisely 8 a.m. Arabian Peninsula time on February 28, 1991, Schwarzkopf transmitted the ceasefire order to all coalition forces. The massive military machine that had been destroying Iraqi forces with industrial efficiency ground to a halt. Tank crews traversing to new targets stopped mid-movement. Artillery batteries with rounds loaded and coordinates calculated stood down. Apache pilots with Iraqi convoys in their sights turned away. The war, the shooting war, was over after exactly 100 hours of ground combat. The immediate aftermath was eerie. Soldiers who'd been operating on adrenaline and minimal sleep suddenly had nothing to do. The background noise of artillery, airstrikes, and vehicle engines faded to an almost oppressive silence. Some troops cheered, others sat stunned, processing what they'd just experienced. Many simply fell asleep where they stood, exhaustion finally claiming bodies that had been running on combat chemicals for 4 days straight. Tank crews climbed out of their vehicles for the first time in hours, stretching cramped limbs and breathing air that wasn't recycled through ventilation systems. The statistical accounting began immediately, and the numbers told a story of unprecedented military dominance. Coalition forces had lost 292 killed in action across all services and nations, a number so low it seemed almost miraculous. American deaths totaled 147, with 145 non-hostile deaths, accidents, friendly fire, illness, bringing the total American fatalities to 292. The British lost 47 killed. Arab coalition forces collectively lost 39. French casualties were minimal. These numbers represented real human tragedies. Families destroyed, futures ended, potential unrealized. But in the context of military operations involving over 700,000 coalition troops against a 650,000-man Iraqi force, they were astonishingly light. Iraqi casualties remained disputed and would never be precisely known. Estimates ranged wildly from 20,000 to 100,000 killed, with the most credible analyses suggesting somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 Iraqi military deaths. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Over 80,000 were prisoners. The Iraqi military as an organized fighting force had ceased to exist. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 tanks destroyed or captured, 2,400 armored personnel carriers eliminated, 2,600 artillery pieces destroyed, and the entire air force either destroyed or fled to Iran. The Republican Guard, Iraq's elite force, had been gutted even if not completely annihilated. The Tawakalna division was effectively destroyed. The Medina division was heavily damaged. The Hammurabi division had suffered catastrophic losses attempting to retreat across the Hor al-Hamar causeway. But Saddam Hussein remained in power in Baghdad, and that fact would haunt the Bush administration and shape Middle Eastern politics for the next 12 years. The decision not to march on Baghdad, not to pursue regime change, was deliberate and based on sound reasoning. The UN mandate authorized liberating Kuwait, not conquering Iraq. Occupying Baghdad would fracture the Arab coalition. Nation-building in Iraq would require long-term occupation that Americans wouldn't support, and nobody knew what would follow Saddam, possibly something worse. But the decision left Iraq's dictator alive, wounded but dangerous, capable of rebuilding his military and brutalizing his population. Even more immediately troubling were the uprisings that erupted across Iraq in the war's aftermath. Shiites in southern Iraq and Kurds in the north, encouraged by American rhetoric about Iraqis overthrowing Saddam, rebelled against the regime. For a brief moment in March 1991, it appeared that Saddam's government might collapse from internal revolt. Then Iraqi forces, including helicopter gunships that coalition forces allowed to fly despite the ceasefire agreement, brutally suppressed the uprisings with tactics that included mass executions, chemical weapons against Kurdish civilians, and systematic destruction of Shiite holy sites. Thousands died in the crackdowns. Coalition forces, positioned inside Iraq with overwhelming military superiority, watched without intervening. The decision not to support the uprisings was pragmatic, but morally agonizing. Bush and his advisors feared that supporting Shiite rebels would lead to Iranian-dominated southern Iraq, that supporting Kurdish independence would antagonize Turkey, and that getting involved in Iraq's civil conflicts would trap American forces in exactly the kind of quagmire the clean, limited war had avoided. But Kurdish and Shiite Iraqis, who'd believed American statements about supporting those who opposed Saddam, felt betrayed. The images of refugees fleeing Iraqi government forces, while American helicopters flew overhead without helping, created a stain on the victory's moral clarity. General Schwarzkopf, conducting the ceasefire negotiations with Iraqi military commanders at Safwan on March 3rd, later admitted that he'd made a critical error. When Iraqi generals asked if they could fly helicopters, claiming they needed them for transportation because coalition forces had destroyed bridges, Schwarzkopf agreed without fully considering the implications. Those helicopters were used to massacre Shiite rebels in southern Iraq and bomb Kurdish civilians. Schwarzkopf, a commander who'd managed the war's military aspects brilliantly, found himself outmaneuvered in the political negotiations that followed. The victory parades back in America, ticker-tape celebrations in New York, ceremonies in Washington, welcome home rallies across the country, celebrated an undeniable military triumph. The United States had demonstrated a revolutionary new way of warfare. Precision weapons, stealth technology, integrated joint operations, all-volunteer professional forces, and overwhelming technological superiority. The Vietnam Syndrome, the perceived reluctance of Americans to support military action after that war's trauma, appeared to be cured. The military was ascendant in public opinion. Powell, Schwarzkopf, and other senior commanders became household names. But among the troops returning home, reactions were more complex. Yes, they'd won decisively. Yes, casualties were miraculously light. Yes, the operation had been a military masterpiece. But many struggled to reconcile the lopsided nature of the victory with their understanding of war. This hadn't been the epic struggle they'd prepared for. Iraqi forces, so fearsome in intelligence briefings, had collapsed or surrendered with minimal resistance. The anticipated chemical weapons attacks never came. The fortifications were abandoned or easily breached. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a tank commander who'd fought at 73 Easting, captured the ambivalence. "We trained for years expecting the fight of our lives. What we got was a 4-day turkey shoot. I'm grateful we didn't take heavy casualties, but part of me wonders if we really tested ourselves, or if we just had such overwhelming advantages that the outcome was never in doubt." The 100-hour ground war had achieved its stated objectives. Kuwait was liberated, Iraqi military power was shattered, and coalition casualties were minimal. By any conventional measure, it was a stunning success. The most lopsided military victory since the Six-Day War, perhaps the most technologically sophisticated campaign ever conducted. But the decision to stop after 100 hours, to leave Saddam in power, to abandon Iraqi rebels who'd believed American rhetoric, these choices would echo through the following decades. The unfinished business of 1991 would eventually pull America back to Iraq in 2003, this time without the clear UN mandate, without the broad coalition, and without the clean exit strategy. The 100-hour war had won the battle, but, as events would prove, hadn't ended the conflict. It had merely paused it, leaving future presidents to deal with the consequences of victory that was decisive, but incomplete. 3 days after the ceasefire, on March 3, 1991, Norman Schwarzkopf sat across a battered table from a delegation of Iraqi generals at the Safwan airfield, just inside Iraqi territory. The tent where negotiations took place was Spartan, folding chairs, maps spread across tables, and an atmosphere thick with the tension of victors meeting the vanquished. The Iraqi delegation, led by Lieutenant General Sultan Hashim Ahmad Altai and Lieutenant General Salah Aboud Mahmoud, arrived in Soviet-made helicopters, their uniforms crisp, but their faces betraying the exhaustion and humiliation of total defeat. Schwarzkopf, flanked by Saudi and Kuwaiti officers, to emphasize the coalition's Arab component, outlined the ceasefire terms with the bluntness of someone who held every card in the deck. The terms were deliberately designed to be militarily crippling, but not politically regime-threatening. A delicate balance that reflected Washington's ambivalence about Iraq's future. Iraqi forces would release all coalition prisoners immediately. They would provide maps of all minefields in Kuwait. They would accept no-fly zones north of the 36th parallel and south of the 32nd parallel, creating protected areas for Kurdish and Shiite populations. All Iraqi forces would withdraw from Kuwait completely, abandoning equipment that coalition forces would destroy or capture. The Republican Guard divisions that had escaped the 100-hour war would be allowed to retreat to Iraq proper, but they'd leave Kuwait as a shattered force, not an army in being. Then came the moment that would haunt Schwarzkopf for the rest of his life. General Altai, speaking through an interpreter, made a seemingly innocuous request. Could Iraqi forces fly helicopters for transportation and administrative purposes? The coalition had destroyed most of Iraq's bridges, he explained, making ground transportation difficult. Helicopters would be necessary for military commanders to communicate with their units and for government officials to maintain control. Schwarzkopf, focused on military concerns and eager to wrap up negotiations, agreed with barely a moment's consideration. The decision seemed trivial at the time. What threat could a few transport helicopters pose after the most lopsided military victory in modern history? Within days, those helicopters were gunning down Shiite rebels in southern Iraq. Iraqi Mi-24 Hind gunships, Heavily armed combat helicopters, not transports, strafed civilian areas in Basra, Najaf, and Karbala. Iraqi forces used helicopter mobility to rush Republican Guard units to suppress uprisings that, just days earlier, had seemed poised to topple Saddam's regime. Schwarzkopf, watching CNN footage of Iraqi helicopters attacking civilians while American forces sat in southern Iraq with the capability to stop it, realized he'd been outmaneuvered in the one arena where he lacked expertise: political negotiation. "I got suckered," he later admitted in interviews, his voice carrying the bitterness of a commander who'd won every battle but contributed to losing the peace. The Shiite uprising in southern Iraq had erupted spontaneously as Iraqi forces retreated in chaos from Kuwait. In Basra, Iraqi soldiers returning from the front turned their weapons on Saddam's internal security forces, touching off a rebellion that spread rapidly through Shiite-majority cities. Rebels seized government buildings, toppled statues of Saddam, and publicly executed Ba'ath Party officials in acts of vengeance for decades of oppression. For approximately 2 weeks in early March, southern Iraq descended into revolutionary chaos where the regime's authority simply evaporated. Shiite clerics who'd been underground for years emerged to lead resistance. Deserters from the Iraqi army joined the uprising. Citizens who'd suffered under Saddam's dictatorship saw their moment for liberation. Simultaneously, in northern Iraq, Kurdish Peshmerga forces launched their own uprising. The Kurds had been brutalized by Saddam's regime for decades. Poison gas attacks on Halabja in 1988 had killed 5,000 civilians, and the Anfal campaign of systematic destruction had murdered tens of thousands more. When Iraqi authority collapsed in the war's aftermath, Kurds seized the opportunity for autonomy, if not independence. Kurdish forces captured Kirkuk, Erbil, and other major cities. The green-white-red Kurdish flag flew over government buildings. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Iraqi Kurdistan was free. Both uprisings had been encouraged, however inadvertently, by American rhetoric. President Bush's State of the Union address had called on the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside. CIA radio broadcasts beamed into Iraq encouraged military officers to overthrow Saddam. The message was clear: rise up against the dictator, and America will support you. When Shiites and Kurds actually did rise up, they expected American backing, or at minimum, American forces preventing Saddam from using his military to crush the rebellions. That support never came. The reasons for American non-intervention were complex and, from Washington's perspective, defensible. The UN mandate authorized liberating Kuwait, not regime change in Iraq or support for rebellions. The coalition, particularly Arab members, was already fragmenting. Supporting Shiite rebels would be interpreted as empowering Iran, Iraq's Persian neighbor and rival. Supporting Kurdish independence would enrage Turkey, a NATO ally that suppressed its own Kurdish population. Most critically, Bush's advisors feared that getting involved in Iraq's internal conflicts would trap American forces in exactly the kind of nation-building quagmire that the clean, limited war had avoided. Let the Iraqis sort out their own government, the thinking went. America's job was liberating Kuwait, not rebuilding Iraq. But the scenes of Iraqi helicopter gunships attacking civilians, while American forces sat idle just miles away, created moral dissonance that no amount of political rationalization could resolve. CNN cameras captured Kurdish refugees fleeing into the mountains, pursued by Iraqi forces that coalition aircraft could have destroyed with a single sortie. Shiite civilians in Basra were massacred by Republican Guard units that American forces had failed to destroy during the 100-hour war. The Imam Ali Mosque in Najaf, one of Shiism's holiest sites, was damaged by Iraqi artillery. Mass graves would later be discovered containing thousands of victims from the post-war crackdowns. General John Shalikashvili, coordinating humanitarian relief efforts for Kurdish refugees, flew over the Turkish-Iraqi border in early April and saw a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds, entire families with children, elderly, and sick, were fleeing into the mountains to escape Iraqi retribution. Freezing temperatures, lack of food and water, and inadequate shelter were killing refugees by the hundreds daily. Children were dying from exposure and dehydration within sight of American helicopters that could have delivered aid but initially lacked authorization to enter Iraqi territory. Shalikashvili's reports back to Washington were blunt. This was a moral catastrophe happening in real time, and America bore some responsibility for encouraging the uprising, then abandoning those who answered the call. The international outcry eventually forced a response. In April, Bush authorized Operation Provide Comfort, creating a safe haven in northern Iraq, protected by coalition air power. American, British, and French forces established a security zone where Kurds could return from the mountains without fear of Iraqi attack. Air patrols enforced the no-fly zone north of the 36th parallel, preventing Iraqi aircraft from operating in Kurdish regions. The operation saved thousands of lives and established a de facto Kurdish autonomous region that would last until the 2003 invasion. But it was a reactive humanitarian mission, not the proactive support that might have succeeded in overthrowing Saddam when his regime was most vulnerable. The Shiites received no such protection. The southern no-fly zone south of the 32nd parallel wasn't established until August 1992, long after Iraqi forces had brutally suppressed the uprising. Thousands of Shiites fled to refugee camps in Saudi Arabia or Iran. Others disappeared into mass graves that would be discovered only after Saddam's regime finally fell 12 years later. The Marsh Arabs, Shiite communities living in the wetlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, faced systematic destruction as Saddam's regime drained the marshes to eliminate both the ecosystem and the people who lived there, an environmental and cultural catastrophe that amounted to slow-motion genocide. Back in America, victory celebrations masked the uncomfortable questions about the war's aftermath. On June 8, 1991, Washington, D.C. hosted the National Victory Celebration, a massive parade down Constitution Avenue featuring 8,800 troops representing all coalition nations. Schwarzkopf and Powell rode in the lead vehicle, waving to crowds estimated at $200,000 who lined the streets. Confetti rained down in ticker-tape tradition. Marching bands played patriotic music. M1A1 Abrams tanks rumbled down Pennsylvania Avenue, the first time tanks had been displayed in a Washington victory parade since World War II. President Bush gave speeches celebrating the military's performance and the vindication of American values. The yellow ribbons that had decorated trees and mailboxes across America since August came down, replaced by American flags and "Welcome Home" banners. Soldiers returning from the Gulf received treatment that was deliberately designed to contrast with Vietnam veterans' bitter homecoming. Parades, ceremonies, discounts at restaurants, strangers thanking them for their service. The "support our troops" ethos that had emerged during the deployment continued as soldiers mustered out, transitioning back to civilian life with GI Bill benefits and public appreciation that Vietnam veterans had never experienced. But the triumphalism masked deeper questions that historians and military analysts were already beginning to ask. Had the war achieved its objectives or merely postponed future conflict? Saddam remained in power, his regime weakened but intact, his capacity for regional mischief diminished but not eliminated. The decision to stop after 100 hours looked prudent in February 1991, but increasingly questionable as Saddam's post-war brutality became clear. The coalition that had been so impressively assembled for liberating Kuwait would never be rebuilt. The political circumstances that allowed Syrian, and Israeli interests to temporarily align, that convinced the Soviets to abandon a client state, that got Arabs to fight alongside Western forces, were unique to that moment and wouldn't recur. The military learned different lessons from the same war. The Air Force concluded that precision air power could win wars with minimal ground involvement, pointing to the 38-day air campaign's devastating effectiveness. The Army emphasized that ground forces remained essential for decisive victory, noting that air power alone hadn't dislodged Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The Marine Corps validated their expeditionary warfare doctrine. The Navy pointed to the blockade's effectiveness and Tomahawk, cruise missiles' surgical strikes. Every service found vindication for their preferred operational concepts, creating bureaucratic momentum for systems and doctrines that wouldn't necessarily apply to future conflicts. The technological revolution demonstrated in Desert Storm sparked a global arms race as nations sought similar capabilities. Precision-guided munitions, stealth technology, satellite navigation, integrated command and control. The American way of war became the model that militaries worldwide sought to emulate, or for potential adversaries to counter. China studied the Gulf War intensively, drawing conclusions about American military vulnerabilities that would shape their modernization programs. Russia, humiliated by the performance of their exported weapons systems, began developing asymmetric capabilities designed to negate American technological advantages. Iran observed that standing armies were obsolete against American power and doubled down on irregular warfare, militia forces, and asymmetric tactics. For the soldiers themselves, the victory was real, but the satisfaction was complex. They'd done their jobs magnificently. Minimal friendly casualties, overwhelming enemy defeat, objectives achieved. But many struggled with the lopsidedness of the victory. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, an infantry squad leader who'd breached Iraqi defenses with the Marines, captured the ambivalence in a letter home. "We won. Completely. Totally. The Iraqis never had a chance. Part of me is proud. We trained hard, fought well, protected each other. But part of me wonders if we really proved anything, or if we just had so many advantages that victory was inevitable. And part of me thinks about the Iraqi soldiers, conscripts who didn't want to be there, dying in their bunkers because Saddam put them in an impossible position. The environmental catastrophe Saddam unleashed as a final act of spite would last longer than the war itself. Over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells were set ablaze by retreating Iraqi forces, creating apocalyptic scenes that photographers captured in images of fire and smoke that turned midday into midnight. The fires burned for months, consuming 6 million barrels of oil daily, creating environmental damage that would take years to repair. Teams of firefighters from around the world, including the legendary Red Adair, worked throughout 1991, extinguishing wells, one by one. The last fire wasn't extinguished until November 1991, 9 months after the war ended. The economic cost to Kuwait exceeded $50 billion. The environmental impact, particulate pollution, contaminated soil, destroyed ecosystems, would persist for decades. As 1991 progressed and the immediate euphoria faded, the incomplete nature of the victory became increasingly apparent. Saddam was contained but not removed. Iraq was defeated but not pacified. The coalition had demonstrated unprecedented military effectiveness but hadn't solved the underlying political problems that had made the war necessary. UN sanctions and no-fly zones created a frozen conflict that would persist for 12 years. Not quite war, not quite peace, but a state of permanent tension that consumed diplomatic energy and military resources, while Iraqi civilians suffered under Saddam's continued rule and international sanctions. The Persian Gulf War had been sold as a clean, limited conflict with clear objectives and decisive results. The 100-hour ground war seemed to validate that promise, quick, overwhelming, with minimal coalition casualties. But the aftermath revealed the limitations of military solutions to political problems. Armies could liberate territory, destroy enemy forces, and achieve battlefield dominance with unprecedented efficiency. But they couldn't resolve the fundamental question of what came next, how to deal with a dictator who remained in power, or how to handle the moral obligations created when American rhetoric encouraged uprisings that America then abandoned. The reckoning for those decisions was still coming, though it would take another president, another war, and another decade of conflict before the full cost became clear.